Chapter 1. Callie's smile froze when she caught a glimpse of a familiar face as a man entered the diner accompanied by a large, imposing dog. What in the world was Bryce Flynn doing here? Their gazes locked, his intense green gaze seeming to look right through her. It wasn't easy to shake off the impact of Bryce's presence as she continued performing her duties, taking the coffee pot around to refill her customers' mugs. Her mind whirled as she made small talk. She couldn't imagine why Bryce and his K9, a beautiful German shepherd named Kirby, had shown up here at Darla's diner. They didn't see cops dropping in for breakfast on a regular basis. This area wasn't part of the usual cop beat. Then again, Bryce wasn't dressed in his cop uniform. Did that mean he was off duty? She hated to admit how handsome he looked in his quilted vest and long-sleeved, checkered flannel shirt accompanied by a pair of worn jeans. She much preferred his casual look to the uniform he normally wore. December in Los Angeles could be cold, especially this early. 7:30 in the morning to be exact. She frowned. It seemed awfully early for him to be up and about on his day off. Yeah, the more she thought about it, the more she knew there was no way Bryce's being there was an accident. No, somehow he'd tracked her down. The better question was why he'd bothered. She self-consciously tugged at her ill-fitting puke green polyester uniform, wishing she was wearing something nicer. Ridiculous thought because she had nothing to prove to Bryce Flynn. She didn't much like him. It had been roughly 2 months since she last saw him. After he'd rescued her from the Desert Death Rays motorcycle gang, stashing her and her friend Ava in a safe house for protection. Oh, he'd been nice enough until she'd realized he was a cop. That made him off-limits. Logically, she knew there were good cops and bad ones. She seemed to only find the bad ones. She'd felt guilty about leaving the safe house so soon after he'd rescued her, but she had known it was for the best. However, she'd been completely stunned to see the news brief the following morning about a shootout involving the Death Rays. Her gaze had been glued to the television mounted high in a corner of the subway station, as she'd recognized the house that had been riddled with bullets as the same place she'd sneaked away from mere hours earlier. At the time, she'd worried about Ava's safety. They'd lost their cheap disposable phones, so she couldn't check up on her friend and former coworker. For several days, she'd lived in fear her friend was dead and her baby too, until she'd caught a brief clip of Ava and Nico leaving the hospital together. The press had jumped on the story of the pregnant woman who'd escaped the death rays with the help of several former Navy SEALs, and had given birth to a baby girl. Jane. Callie's heart had twisted with regret when she'd heard the news. She'd wanted to be there with Ava when she gave birth. She and Ava had joked about whether she was having a girl or a boy. Callie kept calling her stomach Jaden, while Ava had insisted the baby was Jane. Apparently, Ava had been right. She missed her friend more than she could have imagined. Once she and Ava had planned to relocate to Mexico after her baby was born. But Ava had found Nico Ramirez, or rather Nico had found Ava. Instantly, she'd known the two would end up together. And she was happy for her friend. Truly happy. Ava deserved to be loved by a man like Nico. A happily ever after she'd never know. Hi, Callie. She jerked, sloshing coffee from the pot when Bryce called her name. He'd taken a seat in an empty booth along the row of windows facing the street. She drew in a deep breath and forced a smile. A customer was a customer, and a tip was a tip. She needed every dollar she could earn during her shift. Hello, Bryce. Coffee? Yes, please. She filled his cup, avoiding his gaze. Welcome to Darla's Diner. I'll be back once you've had a chance to review the menu. Their plastic menus were on each table in the form of a placemat. Yeah, this place was hardly high class, but the food was decent. She'd needed money, and Darla, the owner, hadn't asked many questions. Callie had been grateful for the opportunity, especially since she was working 2 jobs. Her day job was here at the diner, but she also worked in another restaurant too, on Friday and Saturday nights. A restaurant called The Flame. There, the owner made her wear a low-cut, skin-tight uniform, which she hadn't liked. But the tips were great, so she'd gritted her teeth and put up with the groping customers. Yet she was still behind on her rent. No surprise since she hadn't found anyone to help share a place with. At least, no one she trusted. One of her fellow servers at the Flame had offered to move in with her, but the way Stacy had fawned over her customers, even going out with them after work, made Callie suspicious that she was doing more than serving them drinks. Nope. Callie wasn't on board with that kind of thing. Any chance you have time for a break? Bryce cradled his mug in his hands. I'd like to talk. The tiny hairs on the back of her neck lifted in warning. We don't have anything to discuss. And no, I don't get breaks. That wasn't entirely true. Once the morning rush had passed, she was able to grab a few minutes, but talking to a cop wasn't something she wanted to do while on break. Or off break. Or ever. She quickly turned away, grateful one of the orders had come up. After delivering the 2 breakfast platters laden with food to her customers, she reluctantly returned to Bryce's table. Pulling out her notebook, she stood with her pen poised over the pad. Are you ready to order? Veggie omelet, please. She lifted her brow but wrote down the order. Most people who came to Darla's diner preferred food laden with grease. Fried eggs, bacon, sausage, potatoes, etc. Was Bryce some sort of health nut? Maybe. His muscular physique was an example of how much he worked out. His strength was intimidating, but she did her best to ignore that. She might not trust Bryce, but he didn't come across as an abusive man either. Beneath the table, Kirby shifted into a more comfortable position. Got it. Callie, wait. He caught her arm as she moved away. What time do you get off? I really need to talk to you. It's about Otto. The name of the Death Rays biker she'd briefly spent some time with caused ice to congeal in her veins. What about him? There was a brief pause before Bryce responded. He's dead. She blinked in surprise, then shrugged, feeling her muscles relax in relief. Otto being gone was one less problem for her to worry about. Don't expect me to cry any tears over that news. Have you seen him lately? A flash of anger hit hard. The idiot motorcycle gang member gets himself killed, and she's a suspect. And wasn't that the story of her life? No. She yanked out of his grasp and was about to walk away, when she slipped on a spot of coffee she'd dropped on the floor. She lost her balance and fell forward just as there was a loud crack, followed by the glass window of the cafe shattering into zillions of pieces. Callie? Bryce lunged from the booth seat to cover her with his body. She hit the linoleum floor hard beneath his weight. She heard Kirby barking, and it took her a minute to understand what had just happened. Someone had tried to kill her. No, not her. Maybe Bryce. He was a cop, and had no doubt made many enemies along the way. And hadn't Bryce just told her Otto was dead? If anyone had asked, she'd have named him as the most likely guy to come after her with a gun. I'm a cop. Everyone stay down and remain calm, Bryce ordered in a commanding tone. She felt his weight shift as he pulled his cell phone from his pocket. This is off-duty K-9 Officer Bryce Flynn in Kirby. Shots fired at Darla's Diner in West Los Angeles. Requesting backup and a bus. Callie tried to move out from beneath Bryce's heavy weight, but it was impossible. The guy was built like an offensive lineman for the Rams. Kirby crawled forward on his belly from beneath the table to be near them. She couldn't deny having a soft spot for dogs. In her opinion, Kirby was Bryce's only redeeming quality. Let me up. Not until the police are on scene. His tone was calm, then he raised his voice to ask, anyone hurt? Please remain calm, an ambulance will be here shortly. A chorus of negative replies echoed around the cafe, although from her spot beneath Bryce, she couldn't see anyone. If someone is unconscious or dead, they can't respond, she whispered. I know, Bryce agreed, his voice low and husky near her ear. It reminded her of the night he'd rescued her from the Death Rays warehouse, where she'd been chained to the bed, after being kidnapped from a restaurant in San Bernardino. He'd risked his life back in September to free her from the motorcycle gang. It was ironic that he was here with her again now. My goal is to keep them calm until the police arrive. That was understandable, and to be honest, he was doing a good job. Maybe because he'd announced himself as a cop, There was less panic and screaming. Or maybe they'd gotten too accustomed to violent crime in the city, she thought wearily. There was no more gunfire, leaving her to believe the shooter was long gone. She was about to tell Bryce that too, but held her tongue upon hearing the approaching sound of police sirens. "Stay down with Kirby, okay?" Bryce lifted himself off her, and she turned to look at Kirby. The large German shepherd was almost nose to nose with her, and he surprised her by licking her cheek. She couldn't help but smile. How the dog remembered her, she had no idea. Well, other than she knew this particular canine was incredibly smart and well-trained. She reached over to pet his sleek fur. The dog helped calm her racing heart. Cops swarmed the place, and soon she was helped to her feet by a uniformed officer. She instinctively moved away from him to check on her coworkers and other customers. Incredibly, no one was seriously hurt. Some had sustained cuts from flying glass and bruises from hitting the floor, but nothing worse. Which brought the entire incident right back to her. To the fact that the shooter had only one target in mind when he aimed and fired his weapon. To kill her. Her knees went weak. She sank down into the closest empty seat. Just the thought of starting over in a new place made her want to scream in frustration. Running from one place to another was wearing her down. At 28, she felt twice her age. Who wanted to kill her and why? Obviously, someone who wasn't Otto. Without answers to those two questions, she'd have little choice but to move on. Again. And alone. Bryce swallowed a wave of frustration. The cops were doing a good job in processing the scene, but he wanted to wrap things up here very quickly so he could take Callie someplace safe. If she hadn't slipped, she'd likely be dead right now. Just like Otto. He sent up a silent prayer of thanks to God for watching over them. Especially Callie. He'd known she was working at the diner now for the past few days, but hadn't wanted to scare her off. The last time they were together, she'd run away, leaving the safe house rather than sticking around him and his SEAL buddies. He'd tried to find her, but it had taken far longer than he liked to admit to track her here. His goal was to approach her one day after work, just to make sure she was doing okay. But then he'd learned Otto Redmond had been killed at close range by a shot to the heart with a small caliber pistol. His mind had gone straight to a woman as a suspect. Any other perp who'd been that close would have shot him in the head. But the heart. That seemed to indicate a woman had done him in. Otto hadn't been a nice guy, far from it. Bryce had no doubt the guy had made dozens of enemies while hanging with the desert death rays, and he had likely killed people too. But murder was murder, which meant Otto was now a victim. While Bryce was off the clock today, his goal had been to talk to Callie before anyone from the homicide squad uncovered her previous relationship with the dead man. That she had a possible motive for killing him. What makes you believe Ms. Burgess was the intended target? Sergeant Grossman pinned him with a keen gaze. Because she was the only one standing in the line of fire. He didn't want to go into Callie's past, especially not now. He rested his hand on Kirby's head, keeping the canine close. If she hadn't slipped and fallen as the gunfire rang out, she'd be dead. Sergeant Grossman raked his gaze over the area for a moment, then asked, "And how do you know Ms. Burgess?" "I hardly know her, we met briefly a few months ago." That was true. Bryce didn't want to lie, but he didn't want to implicate Callie more than necessary. Keeping his responses brief and truthful was the best he could do. Especially knowing Callie was in danger from some madman with a gun. "I've taken her statement." Grossman frowned. "She claims she has no enemies, no one who would want to kill her. Furthermore, she seems to think you were the target." He swallowed a groan. No surprise Callie was trying to deflect the attention away from her and onto him. It was annoying how much she didn't like him. He'd never hurt her, just the opposite. He'd helped her escape the death rays. He shrugged, keeping his tone even. "Anything is possible, but if I was the target, the shooter was off by a mile." "Yeah, okay. We'll continue to work the scene. We found the shell casing, it's for a 9mm handgun. 9mm handguns were a dime a dozen in this city. It seemed like every single perp he came across had one. That alone wouldn't help, but maybe if they could find the slug. He thought back to the scene at the diner, those seconds when Callie had slipped as the glass shattered beneath the force of the bullet. I believe the shooter was standing relatively close. If he was far away, it wouldn't be as easy to see inside the diner in broad daylight. Good point, Grossman agreed. You might want to check the counter for a bullet fragment. Bryce was glad there hadn't been a customer seated in the spot along the counter where Callie had been. Yep, got the crime scene techs working on that. Good. He tried to think of anything else that may help with the investigation. It was tempting to mention Otto, but the guy was dead. Yet he had no proof Otto's murder and this attempt to shoot Callie were related. Unless, of course, the pair had made someone mad. Maybe the same shooter had done both deeds. If that was the case, he'd need to come clean with the sergeant. But he needed more time to talk to Callie first. No easy task since she not only didn't like him, she also didn't trust him. Despite the way he'd saved her life. Not that he was looking for an award or anything. Saving people and keeping them protected was his job. But he wasn't sure he deserved her dislike and distrust either. Whatever. He glanced down at Kirby. They were a good team. Kirby loved him no matter what. And Kirby had been his constant companion since he'd lost his wife 3 years ago. Grossman waved his hand. You and Kirby can leave, I know it's your day off. Thanks. He'd been keeping an eye on Callie and saw her huddled with Darla the cook and another server, the one who worked behind the counter. Both women were in their mid-50s, which was probably why Callie's job had been to take care of waiting tables. Less walking around for the other two. He led Kirby over to where the three of them were sitting just outside the damaged building. Callie? Are you ready to go? For a moment, her eyes narrowed, but she must have reconsidered a negative response because she nodded. Yes, but can you help Darla and Pat understand how long the cafe will be a crime scene? This is their livelihood. The scene will be cleared in an hour or two. He turned toward Darla. You need to call your insurance company about getting the glass window replaced. Once that's done, you can reopen. I have. They're sending someone out this afternoon. Darla glanced around, seemingly depressed. I'll still lose at least 2 days of business, maybe more because we're closed on the Christmas holiday. I'm sorry. He truly felt bad for her and those who worked in the cafe, but there wasn't anything he could do to change the timeline. He could, however, pay for his meal. He pulled out his wallet and gave Darla more than double what his bill would have cost. I'm sorry for what you're going through. Thank you so much. Darla pocketed the money. Callie shot him a surprised look, then for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled. Yes, thanks. She stood. I better go. Both of you take care, okay? You too. I'll call you when we've been cleared to reopen for business, Darla said. I'll even pay you to help clean the place up if you'd like. A flash of regret darkened Callie's eyes, but she smiled again and responded, Sounds great. As she turned away, Bryce knew she was lying. She wasn't planning to come back to work at Darla's diner. She was planning to do what Callie did best. Run. Chapter 2. With reluctance, Callie allowed Bryce to drive her home. She didn't want him to see the awful closet, masquerading as an apartment, that she lived in. The moment he pulled up in front of her building, she reached for the car door handle. Thanks for the ride. She tried to push the door open. He hit the lock. She turned to glare at him. What? I'm a prisoner now. Are you going to arrest me for murdering Otto? No, I'm not going to arrest you, but we still need to talk. He sighed. Please, Callie. I need to understand what's going on. You mean other than some wacko is trying to kill you? Not me, you. He scowled. I know you told Sergeant Grossman that you thought I was the target, but you can't seriously believe that. She looked away. He was right. She didn't think Bryce was the target. Oh, she wanted to, but she didn't. A wave of fear-laced exhaustion hit hard. She needed to get inside and pack her stuff. The sooner she got out of this neighborhood, the better. Let me go, Bryce. I didn't kill Otto, and I have no idea who fired that shot. You're going to run away again, aren't you? His perception was right on target. She turned back to look at him. Wouldn't you? No, I'd stay and fight to figure out who was coming after me. She rolled her eyes. Says the big tough cop with his fierce canine partner. I don't have your strength, your career, or your money. I've got nothing but the clothes in my apartment and a small amount of cash. There's nothing I can do against a gunman other than disappear. To be honest, staying off-grid was her expertise these days. Which made her wonder how Bryce had found her at Darla's. How about we talk first, then I drive you wherever you'd like to go. She mulled that over. Bryce's offer was tempting. She would be able to save some money if he drove her far away from Los Angeles. Will you take me to San Bernardino? She'd considered asking Pedro for her old job back at the Lizard Lounge. Of course, she'd need to find a second job too, but having one secured would be a start. She'd have to live on the street for a while, but it wouldn't be the first time. Based on how things were going lately, it probably wouldn't be the last either. Yes. Although it would be better for you to go to a different city, where no one would think to look for you. She grimaced. I know you're right, but at least I'd have a job in San Bernardino. Starting over isn't easy. I'd like to help Callie. His voice was low and husky. For a moment, her resolve wavered. Then she steeled her determination to stay on her own. If Bryce wasn't a cop, maybe she'd consider his offer. But she knew spending time with him was dangerous. She'd broken the law so often, more than what was reflected on her criminal record. A record she was sure he'd already reviewed. We'll talk first, then you can give me a ride. She glanced at him, expecting him to unlock the door. Let me find a real parking spot first. He put the SUV into gear. I don't want to draw attention by getting a ticket. 10 minutes later, he'd squeezed the SUV into a ridiculously tight parking space several blocks from the apartment building. After letting Kirby out the back hatch, he put the K9 on leash and fell into step beside her. She shivered in the cold. Her thin coat didn't provide much insulation from the cool breeze. Neither did her polyester uniform. She couldn't wait to change her clothes into something that didn't reek of bacon grease. Both times she'd seen Bryce, she'd been wearing goofy-looking restaurant uniforms. The peasant skirt and blouse from the Lizard Lounge, which had been ripped, torn, and dirty after being abducted by the death rays, and now this bile green top and pants. Call her vain, but just once she wanted to look nice in his presence. She didn't want to be wearing an ugly uniform the last time Bryce saw her. I'm on the 3rd floor, there's no elevator. She opened the door and stepped inside. Bryce and Kirby followed close behind. How long have you been here? She grimaced. Almost 2 months. 7 weeks and 1 day to be exact. Bryce didn't ask any more questions as they made their way up 3 flights of stairs. He also didn't so much as breathe heavily at the exertion. Despite being on her feet for long hours each day, she always gasped for breath by the time she reached the 3rd floor. 28 going on 48, she thought grimly. And if she didn't figure out how to stop running, she doubted she'd see her 48th birthday. At this pace, she may not see her 29th birthday. Living on the street and barely making ends meet from payday to payday wasn't easy. It was downright dangerous. It was only a matter of time until she was attacked again or worse. It was one of the reasons she'd initially gone with Otto almost a year ago now, despite his membership with the Death Rays. The large, tattooed biker had been nice to her at first, and she'd imagined he'd keep her safe. But that changed when he began to drink. A lot. Otto had a cruel streak that came out in full force when he was drunk. She'd suffered bruises and a significant head injury before she'd managed to escape. Thankfully, she'd run into Ava, who'd come back to help her. Callie owed Ava her life. She pushed open the door and walked into her tiny apartment. There was no bedroom and barely a kitchen. The only furniture she had was a futon that doubled as her bed, and 2 kitchen chairs around a small table. They'd come with the apartment. And would be left behind. She'd found a small, lopsided Christmas tree in the garbage bin out back. She'd carried it in and set in the corner, but she had not gotten around to making any ornaments for it. The scraggly tree looked as if it might fall over at any moment, and she wished now that she'd never brought it in. Swallowing a sigh, she gestured to the kitchen table. "Have a seat." Bryce swept his gaze around the room, no doubt taking in every detail. To his credit, he didn't say, "Nice place," because it obviously wasn't. The walls were stained and peeling, the linoleum floor missing tiles. Only one burner on the stove worked, and the freezer temp didn't go below 40, making it unusable. All of that, along with her bare and crooked Christmas tree, added up to a pathetic sight. "If you don't mind, I'd like to change my clothes." She gestured to the bathroom. "I won't be long." "Take your time." She pulled a worn suitcase from beneath the futon and took out a clean pair of jeans and a deep blue sweater that accented her eyes. She headed into the bathroom, washing up a bit before donning clean clothes. Feeling better about herself, she kicked the puke green uniform into the corner. Unfortunately, she wouldn't need it anymore. Then she went out to join Bryce at the table. "Ask your questions," she said, dropping into the chair beside him. The space was so small their knees brushed. Kirby's tail thumped the floor in greeting, so she reached down to scratch his ears. "Callie, I don't believe you had anything to do with Otto's murder." His opening statement surprised her. "But after today's shooting, I'm afraid the same person who killed Otto has decided to come after you." She straightened in her seat. "Really? Why?" "The timing is rather coincidental, don't you think?" He held her gaze. "Otto died 3 days ago, and now someone took a shot at you. It's almost as if the shooter is seeking revenge against both of you." "Revenge for what?" She didn't have to fake her confusion. "I've never harmed anyone other than Otto. And that was only to escape his abuse." "You and Otto didn't commit any crimes together?" "No." She flushed, wishing she could leave. But it was her place, and she wasn't going to leave the few things she owned behind. "Why would you ask such a thing?" He lifted his hands palms up as if to placate her. "These are hard questions, Callie, but I'm just trying to understand why someone would want both you and Otto dead. I thought maybe a victim had come to find you both." His logic made sense, but she still didn't appreciate his assumption that she'd participated in some sort of armed robbery. "Shoplifting? Picking pockets?" "Yeah. But only when she was desperate for food. And never armed robbery. She'd never owned a gun. We didn't. Whatever laws Otto broke, he did on his own." "What about another member of the Death Rays motorcycle gang?" Bryce leaned forward, bracing his elbows on the table. He was so close she could see tiny gold flecks in his green eyes. "Do you think one of them has a reason to come after you and Otto?" She averted her gaze from his, needing to stay focused on the question. "I thought the gang was busted up and arrested after the shootout at the OK Corral." Bryce nodded. "The gang broke up once Simon and many others were tossed behind bars. But not all of them were arrested. Some of them are still around." The news was hardly reassuring. She sighed and rubbed her temple. "It could be that one of the Death Rays had come after me, but to kill one of their own? That part doesn't make sense. There was no one that Otto had a beef with." Bryce pressed. A large man's face with a deformed ear flashed in her mind. She forced herself to nod slowly. "Yes, now that you mention it, there was a guy named Charlie Sancho. He and Otto didn't get along, but I never knew why. Otto refused to say other than Sancho was a jerk." She met Bryce's gaze head-on. "Since Otto was a jerk too, especially when he was drunk, I didn't put much credence in his opinion. But maybe they were rivals at one point, who knows?" "Charlie Sancho," Bryce repeated thoughtfully. "Thanks for telling me, it's a place to start." For a nanosecond, she considered mentioning her stepfather. Other than Otto, he was the only one she could think of who'd want to kill her. But she hadn't seen Wade in 12 years, not since the night she'd escaped his attempt to rape her. She'd been 16 at the time and had left without looking back. Her mother hadn't bothered to come look for her either. Callie had always known that her mother would choose Wade over her. And calling the police wouldn't have solved anything. Wade was an LAPD detective. She thrust those thoughts aside. 12 years was a long time. She honestly didn't think Wade Stiller would bother to track her down now. What would be the point? And how would he have found her anyway? She'd stayed under the radar all this time for exactly this reason. To make sure Wade couldn't just pop back into her life. But it did make her realize that Bryce hadn't answered her question at the diner. "You never did explain how you found me," she said. "I'd like to know so that I can learn from my mistake." The corner of his mouth tipped up in a smile. "You didn't make a mistake, Callie. Kirby helped me find you. I used the pillowcase from your room back at the safe house for a scent source. The night you disappeared, he trailed you to the subway, but then of course couldn't continue tracking you since we had no idea where you got off. But over the past few weeks, I took Kirby to various subway stations. Stops that would be likely places for you to get off the subway. It worked. Kirby picked up your scent and eventually led me to Darla's." "Seriously?" She bent over to pet Kirby. She wanted to be angry, but she was more impressed than anything. Kirby is one smart dog. "Agreed." Bryce's smile vanished. "Can you think of anyone else who might have a grudge against you?" "Not that I know of." She stroked Kirby's fur one last time, then stood. "It won't take me long to pack. Most of my stuff is in my suitcase already." It was her habit to be ready to run at a moment's notice. "Like now." "Okay." She tried to ignore Bryce's keen gaze as she removed her few toiletries from the bathroom and stuffed them into her suitcase. She hoped he wasn't planning to renege on his promise of a ride. Oddly enough, she'd missed the stupid apartment. It didn't make sense as the place was a dump and she hadn't been there long. But she had called it home. At least for a brief time. Maybe one day she'd be able to put down roots. But that wasn't today. Or tomorrow. Or even next month. A silly dream that had zero chance of ever coming true. Sympathy was the last thing Callie would want from him, but seeing how she'd lived had tugged at his heart. Especially seeing the small, bare, and lopsided Christmas tree tucked into the corner. It was the only holiday decoration in the place, and he was touched that she'd spent her hard-earned money on it. Or maybe she'd found it, which was more likely. It killed him to think about how hard she was working to make ends meet. Even this tiny place must have cost an arm and a leg to rent each month. He found it difficult to believe the tips at Darla's diner covered her living expenses. He'd wanted to ask how she was managing to pay her bills, but decided he didn't want to hear about any criminal activity. He didn't see any signs of drugs or drug use, not a single bottle of alcohol was in the apartment either, but there were other ways. The very idea of Callie selling herself made him feel sick. Not that she dressed provocatively or anything. He glanced over at her, appreciating her worn jeans and dark blue sweater. Her straight dark hair was longer now than when he'd seen her in September. The ends were neatly trimmed, and he imagined she may have done that herself. She went into the kitchen and rummaged through the cupboards. Moments later, she added boxes of mac and cheese and ramen noodles to the suitcase, along with a bag of dry cereal. Were the rest of her cupboards empty? He felt certain they were. He cleared his throat. "I hope you don't mind if we stop for lunch along the way. I never got breakfast." She hesitated, a flash of indecision darkening her blue eyes. "That sounds good," she finally admitted. "Great." He was strangely relieved she was willing to join him for a meal. Callie was slender but not to the point she looked emaciated. He found himself hoping Darla had provided free or discounted meals to her staff. Lastly, she crossed over to pull something out of the freezer. It was a small TV dinner, but when she opened the box and shook it, a small wad of cash fell out. Callie quickly pocketed the money and tossed the empty box in the corner. Then she crossed over and closed her suitcase. "I'm ready." He took her suitcase from her hands and waited for her to open the apartment door. "Do you have to give notice or anything?" She snorted. Are you kidding? I'm behind on my rent despite working 2 jobs. I'm sure the landlord will be glad I'm gone. Working 2 jobs? The tension around his heart eased. Where else have you been working? The flame on weekends. She arched a brow. What, did you think I was doing something else? Granted, the landlord offered me an alternative to paying him in cash, but I respectively declined. No, Callie. I'm just concerned about your welfare, that's all. He didn't want to admit he'd considered the worst-case scenario. And now he wanted to punch her landlord in the nose. If you need money. I don't. Her voice was clipped. She quickly moved ahead of him to walk down the stairs, seemingly anxious to leave. Based on everything she'd told him, he couldn't really blame her. He and Kirby followed her down, the suitcase not as heavy as he'd expected. Clearly, Callie traveled light. Too light. Yeah, the entire situation bothered him. The fact that she was so willing to uproot herself to start over someplace new. Maybe going to San Bernardino wasn't such a bad idea. Having a job would be a good thing. But where would she live in the meantime? He swallowed hard. In a shelter? On the street? No way. Not happening. He'd put her up someplace until she could get back on her feet. As a cop, he knew firsthand how dangerous it was out there, especially for young, attractive women like Callie. She wouldn't like it, but he'd have to insist. And maybe, just like she'd consented to sharing a meal with him, she'd agree to stay in a motel for a week or so. Callie didn't want to accept charity, but she wasn't stupid either. He felt certain he could use logic to convince her. When she reached the ground floor landing, she paused for a moment, her gaze lingering on the row of mailboxes. As she stepped over to a box simply labeled with the initials CB, the glass door to the apartment building shattered beneath the force of a bullet. Down. Get down, he shouted, letting go of the suitcase as he launched himself toward Callie. He didn't hesitate to throw himself into the line of fire to protect her. The force of his momentum pushed her into the wall of mailboxes where she landed with a muffled groan. Kirby barked wildly, creating a ruckus. Several tenants peered fearfully from doorways, then quickly disappeared as if worried they would be next. For the second time that day, someone had tried to kill Callie. And Bryce feared that the shooter would keep coming after her until she was dead. Chapter 3. For the second time that day, Callie found herself smashed between Bryce and something hard, this time a wall of mailboxes rather than the floor of the diner. Her body would be covered in bruises by morning, not that she was complaining. Being alive was worth the discomfort. Long seconds passed, but just like at the diner, she heard no additional gunshots. It seemed strange the gunman would shoot once, then take off. Not that she was an expert on the process of shooting people. The entire situation defied logic. We're going out through the back, Bryce said in her ear. Ready? She managed a nod. There was no denying she'd been the target of gunfire this time. And probably in the diner too. She hadn't wanted to believe it, but Bryce had been behind her on the stairs. Not out front. She'd caught the shadow of a man lurking beyond the door seconds before the glass shattered. Bryce grabbed her hand and took a moment to snag her suitcase before tugging her down the hall, away from the damaged front door. Kirby stayed near her right side, silent now that they were on the move. The back door wasn't far from the small laundry room. 2 coin-operated washers and dryers, shared by all the tenants in the building, lined the wall. Bryce took a moment to peek inside before stopping at the door. Wait here with Kirby. Without waiting for a response, he pushed open the door, gun in hand, and edged out far enough to scan the area. Kirby was a reassuring presence at her side. There was no doubt in her mind the K9 would attack anyone who threatened her. After a few minutes, Bryce said, "It's clear. Let's get out of here." She didn't need to be asked twice. Without hesitation, she followed Bryce through the doorway and into the chilly December air. Skirting a large garbage dumpster, they took a circuitous route back to his SUV. He used a remote to open the back for Kirby, at the same time he opened her passenger side door. Stay low, he advised before shutting the door. She slid down in the seat. Less than a minute later, Bryce jumped in behind the wheel and drove away from the apartment building just as 2 police squads roared around the corner coming from the opposite direction. "Shouldn't we talk to them?" "Not now. I'll follow up with Sergeant Grossman later." Bryce's expression was grim as he glanced at her. "First we get you someplace safe. Then we figure out who is doing this and why." "I don't know who is doing this or why," she snapped. "If I did, I'd tell you." "I know you said that earlier, and I believe you to a certain extent. But gunmen don't just show up out of nowhere, Callie." His tone was calm but not condescending. "There's a reason this guy keeps coming after you. And I think it's related to your time with the death rays." Would that ill-fated decision to be with Otto and the death rays haunt her forever? She closed her eyes and leaned her forehead against the window. She hated to admit he was right. That Otto ended up murdered 3 days before a gunman came after her was more than a little coincidental. Otto had broken laws, of that she was certain. But she hadn't. Well, she had, but nothing that would be considered a felony. And certainly not as a Bonnie and Clyde duo with Otto. When she realized Bryce was heading farther into the city, she straightened. "Where are you going?" "I thought you were taking me to San Bernardino?" "Not yet." He met her gaze. "The gunman is here, in LA. "Exactly my point. Why would we stay here?" She tried not to give in to the overwhelming fear of the gunman finding her again. The third time might be the charm. Because the handful of death rays who escaped being arrested 3 months ago are also here. I may need to pay them a visit. Please trust me on this, okay? I have a motel in mind where we can stay. We'll discuss our next steps then." She reluctantly nodded. Truthfully, she had little choice but to trust him. He and Kirby had saved her life twice now. Ironically, for the first time in a long while, she didn't have the urge to escape. She had no clue what was going on, but she was clearly safer with Bryce and Kirby than without them. "Okay. Thanks, Callie." He offered a wry smile. "I promise I'll protect you. I know it's not easy for you to trust the police." "It's fine. Sort of fine." At least he hadn't tried to arrest her or dig into what crimes she may have committed. "Do you have to report in for work tomorrow?" He hesitated, then grimaced. "I'll call off work for a few days. The good news is that I'm off over the Christmas holiday this year." Christmas. She'd mentally prepared herself for spending the holiday alone in her tiny apartment, with just her lopsided tree for company. Both Darla's Diner and the Flame were closed on Christmas Day. Which was fine because there wouldn't be many customers anyway, so she wouldn't make any money in tips. For a moment she wondered what it would be like to spend Christmas with Bryce. Then she gave herself a stern reality check. Bryce was only here to keep her safe. Not because he was interested in anything personal. Fine with her, she didn't like cops anyway. Bryce might be handsome and kind, but that could be nothing more than a facade. Hadn't Wade seemed nice and sweet in the early days of his marriage to her mom? Yeah, that hadn't lasted more than a few months. Then his true colors had come bleeding through his fake veneer. Whatever. It didn't matter. Once the danger was over, she wouldn't see Bryce again. 30 minutes later, he pulled into the parking lot of the Green Tree Motel. "Stay here with Kirby, I'll get us a couple of rooms." A couple of rooms? She was surprised to hear that. Then again, Bryce had always been professional with her, none of the leering or groping she'd become accustomed to. "Okay." He returned several minutes later. "We have adjoining rooms, and I hope you don't mind keeping the connecting door between them open. I can't protect you if there's a locked door between us." "I understand." She was touched by his consideration for her privacy. No guy she'd known would ever have done such a thing as get 2 connecting rooms. He drove around to the rooms farthest from the office. She wondered if he'd chosen them on purpose, or if these were the only adjoining rooms available. It seemed logical the motel was booked up this close to Christmas. To her relief, the room was clean. She watched as Bryce set her suitcase on the bed, then held out a key card. "This is yours." "Thank you." She took the key card, then crossed over to open the connecting door. "What about Kirby? Doesn't he need to eat soon?" "I fed him this morning, before meeting up with you at Darla's." He grinned. "Oh, I get it. You're reminding me that I promised to feed you lunch." She felt her cheeks heat with embarrassment. She hadn't been hinting for a meal, although she felt certain he'd heard her stomach growling. Having run out of milk the day before, she'd only had some dry cereal for breakfast. Usually, Darla offered a free meal for her staff, which would have held her over until dinner. "I have ramen noodles, and this motel room has a microwave. I'll be fine." "I think we can do better than ramen noodles," Bryce drawled with a grin. "I'm hungry too, remember? Give me a few minutes and we'll walk over to the restaurant." "Sounds good." She took a moment to move her suitcase to a stand so the bed was clear. It never occurred to her to unpack, that wasn't her norm. She'd run the gamut of living arrangements. First on the street, then in several shelters, which had lasted a long time. Then with a group of girls who'd all worked at the same nightclub, then with the Death Rays, and most recently with Ava. In her experience, it was best to be prepared to leave at a moment's notice. 2 minutes later, the connecting door opened from Bryce's room. He tentatively glanced at her through the opening. "Are you ready?" "Yes." She pocketed her key and joined him in his room. Glancing at Kirby, she asked, "Is he coming too?" "Yep." He held the main door open for her. "You're quite a team," she said as she preceded him outside. "We are, yes." He smiled. It must be nice, she thought wistfully. She loved dogs. Cats too, but she was allergic to them. She would have loved to have the companionship of a dog, especially while living in the small apartment. But she worked long hours and could barely afford to feed herself, so getting a pet was out of the question. Maybe someday, she thought with a sigh. Although, deep down, she didn't believe that day would ever come. The way Callie fawned over Kirby gave Bryce the impression she loved dogs. The first night she'd met Kirby, she'd seemed afraid of him. Somewhat understandable, as Kirby could come across as menacing. The animal was a highly trained canine, so Kirby treated all strangers as potential threats. Once Bryce had introduced her as a friend, Kirby had softened toward her. He kept a keen eye out for trouble as they walked the 4 blocks to the restaurant. Once inside, he was glad they were seated at a table where he could sit with his back against the wall while facing the door. Even though he'd been out of the Navy for 3 years, his training was still deeply ingrained in his actions. He thought about the SEALs he'd met back in September, when he'd helped rescue Callie from the Death Rays, and wished a couple of them were here with him now. He wouldn't have minded if Nico or Caleb were covering his 6. After a few minutes, they were given water, and had placed their order. He ordered a turkey avocado wrap, and Callie surprised him by ordering the same. She'd also gotten fries, but he'd chosen fruit. "Do you always eat healthy?" "Me? Most of the time." He grimaced. "There's heart disease in my dad's side of the family, so I figure it's better to be proactive than wait until I'm the one in the hospital, getting a stent in my heart." She nodded thoughtfully. "I figured you were a fitness nut. It's why I knew you hadn't just stumbled across me at Darla's by accident. You're very perceptive. A good quality for a cop." Her gaze darkened, and she immediately shook her head. Not interested. She'd obviously had a bad experience with a cop at some point, but he didn't press the issue. "I know waiting tables was not your career choice, but something you've done out of necessity. What if you could do something else? Have you given any thought to what you might do?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "I'd go into nursing, although that's impossible now." "Nothing is impossible," he protested. She shook her head, but didn't elaborate. It bothered him to know Callie was still keeping secrets from him. He knew next to nothing about her past, and he'd ruthlessly combed through her criminal background enough to realize she'd been on her own for a long time. 1 criminal possession of marijuana, and several theft charges. Nothing at a felony level, but maybe she thought that was enough to keep her from her dream of becoming a nurse. When their meals arrived, he glanced for a moment at Callie, then reached out to touch her hand. "If you don't mind, I'd like to say grace." "Ah, okay." She seemed flustered but bent her head out of respect. "Lord, we thank you for this food, and for keeping us safe in your loving care. Amen." After a moment's hesitation, she echoed, "Amen." "Thanks." He smiled. "I know you're probably not a believer, but it's important to me." She tilted her head, eyeing him curiously. "I grew up attending church, but after my dad died and my mother remarried, we stopped going." It was the first tidbit of her personal life she'd given him. "I can understand how that would happen. When I was with the SEALs, one of my teammates was big into prayer. He helped me to see the light of accepting God as my Savior. It's more than going to church. With my schedule, one can't always attend services." She ate a few of her French fries before saying, "I guess the way my mom gave up going to church means she didn't take it as seriously as you do." He nodded, then tried his wrap. This hits the spot." "Way better than ramen noodles," she admitted. They ate in silence for a few moments, enjoying the food. He didn't want to ruin her meal, but they still needed to talk. "Callie, you mentioned Charlie Sancho as one of the death rays who didn't like Otto. Or rather, the feeling was mutual. Are you sure Charlie wasn't holding a grudge against you too? And what does Sancho look like?" She lifted one shoulder. Charlie was tall, big, and one of his ears is grossly deformed, something about being bitten by a dog. I think it was his left ear. Anyway, I don't know why Charlie would have a grudge. We didn't really hang out together. Otto was closer to Simon than Charlie was. I always had the impression Charlie didn't approve of how Simon ran things. Bryce knew that Simon Normandy had been the mastermind behind the Desert Death Rays motorcycle gang. But Simon was behind bars and no longer a threat to Callie or to Ava Rampart, who'd married his buddy Nico Ramirez last month. If he'd have found Callie before then, he'd have asked her to attend the wedding with him. Ava asked about Callie every time he saw her, and up until recently, he hadn't been able to reassure Ava that her friend was doing okay. "Now that I think about it, Charlie wasn't close to many of the death rays," Callie said, breaking into his thoughts. "A loner." He considered that. Unusual for a loner to join a biker gang in the first place. "Yeah." She frowned. "I think he was only in it for the money." Bryce knew the death rays had been selling drugs to line their pockets, so her conclusion made sense. Did they have their fingers in any other criminal activity? "How would I know?" Her tone came across as defensive. "You keep treating me like I was involved in all that stuff right along with the death rays, but I wasn't." He lifted his hand. "Sorry, I didn't mean to insinuate that at all. I thought Otto may have confided in you." "He didn't. Besides, I was only with them for a few months. It didn't take long for me to realize getting beaten up by Otto on a regular basis wasn't going to change. If I had known that, I'd have arrested him before he was murdered. He hated knowing she'd suffered at the biker's hands. You should have confided in me rather than running away." "I don't confide in people I don't know." "Yeah, I figured that out after you took off," he said dryly. "By the way, Ava and Nico got married right before Thanksgiving." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "I'm not surprised. I knew they would get together. I saw the news piece about how she gave birth to a baby girl." "Jane," he confirmed. Then he added, "Her full name is Jane Callie Ramirez." Callie's jaw dropped. "Really?" "Yes." He had to smile at her shocked expression. "Ava has been worried sick about you, Callie." "I didn't realize." She stared down at her plate for a moment before adding, "I didn't have a way to contact her, or I would have." "I know, she said the same thing to me." He finished his wrap and the side of fruit, then sat back in his seat. "Maybe once the danger is over, you'd allow me to take you to visit her and baby Jane." "I'd like that," Callie said softly. "Very much." Good. That was one issue settled. But they still had a much larger concern ahead of them. He'd follow up on the Charlie Sancho angle, but he sensed there was more to the shooting than simply not getting along. His heart twisted in his chest when he noticed that Callie carefully ate every single French fry, including the crumbs. She pushed her plate away, then abruptly stiffened. "What's wrong?" He glanced around the restaurant, but didn't see anyone who looked like a candidate for the Death Ray's biker gang. "Is this a cop hangout?" she asked in a low voice. "Oh yeah." He hadn't paid much attention to the pair of uniformed officers who came inside to eat. "I wouldn't call it a hangout exactly, but I've come here while on duty. This is my bureau, which is why I knew about the motel." She sat as if frozen to her seat. "Which bureau? Are we in the West Valley?" "No, this place happens to be close to the border between the West Valley and the West Los Angeles Bureau, but is technically located in the latter." "Why?" "Excuse me, I need to use the bathroom." She bolted out of her seat and headed straight toward the restrooms. He frowned, glancing over at the two cops sitting a few tables over from their booth. He didn't recognize them, but with a city the size of LA, he couldn't say he knew every cop in the bureau by name. They looked to be roughly 10 years older than his age of 30, maybe more. Obviously, the way they showed up here had spooked Callie. Then he realized what that meant. He pulled cash from his wallet, dropping enough on the table to cover the tab with a generous tip, then slid out of the booth. "Come, Kirby." He didn't give the dog the command to seek because he didn't want to use Callie's name out loud, just in case there was a good reason she was afraid of the two cops. As he headed through the restaurant toward the women's restroom, he prayed she hadn't run away again. Chapter 4. Run. Hide. Callie's instincts were screaming at her to get out of the restaurant. Logically, she knew those two cops hadn't recognized her. They couldn't know she was Wade Stiller's missing stepdaughter. But that wasn't the worst part. Bryce worked out of the West LA Bureau. The same one her stepfather worked for. Did Bryce know Wade? What if Wade was his boss? Or a close colleague? The thought made her feel sick to her stomach. She swallowed hard and told herself not to panic. Each of the LA bureaus employed hundreds of cops, so there was a chance the two men hadn't met. She stared at her stricken reflection in the mirror for several long moments. Run? Or stay? If she ran, where would she go? She'd have to use some of her precious cash to get a bus to San Bernardino. Starting over, without her few possessions that were still in her suitcase back at the motel. If she were honest, she'd rather stay with Bryce and Kirby. Running and living off the streets was getting old. Bryce hadn't turned her over to the authorities so far. Hopefully, he wouldn't start now. Blowing out a long, slow breath, she splashed cold water on her face. After grabbing paper towels, she blotted her face. "Callie? Are you in there?" Bryce's low, husky tone held a note of urgency. No surprise, he'd come to find her. She went over to yank open the door. "Yes, I'm here." "Thank you, God," he whispered, his gaze raking over her. "I was worried you'd left on your own again." "I almost did." She crossed the threshold and folded her arms across her chest. Her thin jacket didn't provide much warmth. Kirby greeted her like a long-lost friend, as if she'd been gone for days rather than minutes. She dropped one hand to pet him, then looked at Bryce. "Can we please leave? Or do you need to pay yet?" "I took care of the bill." He gestured to the rear door located at the end of the hallway from the restrooms. "I assume you'd rather not go through the dining room, again?" In answer, she brushed past him toward the rear door. He caught her arm, bringing her close. He held her gently enough, but there was no mistaking the strength in his arms. "Callie, I need you to tell me what's going on." "Not here. Back at the motel." She looked down at his hand on her arm, and he instantly let her go. She wanted to reassure him that he hadn't hurt her, but decided it would be better to get out of there. Bryce was messing with her mind, no doubt about that. She cared a lot about him, considering she didn't like him. Okay, that wasn't true. She liked him fine, but she didn't trust him. Not completely. He'd keep her safe, but if he knew about the rest. Especially if he knew her stepfather on a first-name basis. Yeah, she didn't want to think about his reaction. Bryce and Kirby led the way around the restaurant. They'd walked over from the motel, and she tried to move casually as they retraced their steps. She noticed Bryce constantly swept his gaze from side to side, scoping out the area as they walked. There was no doubt he took the role of protecting her seriously. Kirby, too, often had his nose up sniffing the air. Staying with them had been the right decision. For now. When the motel came into view, she wanted to break into a run, rush inside, and lock the door behind her. There was no reason to panic, she was perfectly safe. Seeing those officers in uniform had rattled her. She needed to shake it off. It was highly unlikely that Wade would be searching for her, after all these years. He had no reason to track her down now. She was about to pull her key card from her pocket, when she heard something digging in the brush near the corner of the motel. Kirby strained at his leash, wanting to investigate. "Stay here," Bryce warned. He and Kirby moved closer to investigate. A series of yipping sounds came from the bush, and a matted ball of fur came rolling out. Kirby lowered his nose, sniffing at what looked like a puppy. Oh, is he a stray? She couldn't help moving forward to investigate. "Easy, Kirby." Bryce bent and scooped the puppy into his arms. No collar, and he looks like he could use a meal. "Can I hold him?" She smiled as Bryce handed her the puppy. She checked, felt too skinny, his hair was matted, but he licked her chin with enthusiasm as if thrilled to be rescued. "We need to give him food and water." Bryce nodded. "Okay, but I'm not sure he's house-trained." Using her key, she opened the door and stepped inside. She knew this was a path to heartbreak. She wouldn't be able to keep the puppy. Not when she could barely feed herself. But she wasn't going to let him suffer either. Bryce used Kirby's dishes to give the stray pup some water and a small bit of food. "We can't give him too much or he'll get sick." "I understand." She set the puppy down, watching as the little guy went over to eat and drink. "I've always wanted a puppy, but that was never an option. We can hold him for a while, but he looks at least part German Shepherd, which means he may belong to someone." Bryce gestured toward the bed. "Please sit down, we need to talk." She waited until Roscoe, the name she'd already given the pup, was finished. Then she picked him up and held him in her arms. The puppy snuggled close and promptly fell asleep. Dropping onto the edge of the bed, she sighed. "I'm sorry if I overreacted to the cops." "You don't have to apologize." He held her gaze. "But I would like to know more about the cop who hurt you." She shouldn't have been surprised. Her actions had been erratic enough for Bryce to put 2 and 2 together to come up with 4. It took a moment to find her voice. "It was a long time ago." "I disagree, based on how frightened you were inside the restaurant." His voice was soft. "I will never hurt you, Callie. But I can't help you if I don't know what's going on." "The past isn't part of the current danger," she protested weakly. "How do you know that for sure?" She didn't. She stroked the puppy's fur, thinking the little guy could use a bath and a good brushing. "Do you know Detective Wade Stiller?" Bryce hesitated. "No, should I?" "He works out of the West Los Angeles Bureau, or at least he did 12 years ago." She shrugged. "I guess he could have transferred somewhere else by now." "Easy enough for me to find out, but who is he to you?" "My stepfather." She forced the words past her tight throat. "He assaulted me and tried to rape me, but I managed to hit him on the head with one of my swimming trophies, long enough to run away." A flash of anger darkened his green eyes. "I hope you reported him to the police." She scoffed. The pup stirred in her arms as if sensing her anger. "Yeah, right. Like anyone would believe me over one of their own." "There would have been a full investigation," he insisted. "And what about your mother? Did she know?" "Wade kept my mother under his thumb. She refused to do anything that might rock the boat. When my dad died, we were destitute. We were evicted from our house and ended up staying in a shelter." She smiled without humor. "Wade was the knight in shining armor, riding in to the rescue. When I disagreed with anything Wade said or did, She told me to keep my mouth shut or we'd be homeless again. Bryce's jaw flexed. How old were you when he attacked you? 16. I know Wade had his cop buddies searching for me, especially during those first few months. Frankly, I'm not sure how I managed to avoid being caught. It was touch and go for a while. God was watching over you, Callie. She shrugged, gazing at the puppy for a moment. She'd witnessed a lot of terrible things while living on the street. It made her wonder why she was worthy of God's protection when so many others weren't. Regardless, there is no reason for Wade to come after me now. You don't think he's the gunman? She stared at him. Do you? Why would he bother? Why risk getting caught? I'm not sure, he admitted. But he needs to be added to the suspect list, along with Charlie Sancho. We'll need to start by finding out where both men are now. I'll start with Wade since he should be easier to track down, especially if he's still a cop. Okay. She tried to shake off her trepidation. Wade wasn't the boogeyman who'd haunted her nightmares. He was a flesh-and-blood man. Thank you for telling me, Callie. Bryce reached out and rested his hand on her knee. I'm honored you trusted me with the truth. A lump lodged in her throat. Gazing into Bryce's compassionate gaze made her want to throw herself into his arms. And never let go. Callie was a tough nut to crack, but Bryce was glad he finally understood her motivation for running. He didn't blame her. In fact, now he wanted to punch Wade Stiller in the nose too. Violence never solves anything, he reminded himself sternly. And he had better things to focus on. He stood, glancing at her and the puppy. I have a computer. Give me some time to dig up what I can on both men. Once we know more, we can plan our next steps. In the meantime, you'll want to take the little guy outside, see if he'll do his business. Sure. Come, Roscoe. Callie moved to the door. Smiling wryly at how she'd already named the puppy, he took Kirby through the connecting door to his room. He only had one change of clothing with him, but of course he had all of Kirby's things and his laptop too. Once he had everything transferred from his SUV to the motel room, Bryce set up the laptop and went to work. He figured Wade Stiller would be easy to find, and that was true. In a matter of minutes, he had a photograph of Callie's stepfather up on his screen. The headshot was taken roughly 5 years ago, when Stiller had received a promotion. The guy was big across the chest and had a serious expression on his face, the way most cops did when getting their picture taken. It appeared Stiller still worked for the West Los Angeles Bureau, which was interesting. Next, he did a quick search to see if Stiller was still married. He found the marriage of Wade Stiller to Helen Abernathy roughly 13 years ago. There was no divorce on file. Either Callie's mother was still with Stiller, or they weren't legally separated or divorced. Callie's last name was Burgess, not Abernathy, but he understood now that she'd been using a fake ID for the past, 12 years. It killed him to know she'd been on her own for so long. He toggled back to the picture of Stiller. He did a search on the guy's address, but didn't come up with anything. Not too surprising, as cops tended to stay off-grid when it came to their personal lives. And good old Wade had plenty of reason to stay hidden. As far as Bryce was concerned, once a predator, always a predator. He had no doubt there were other skeletons in Stiller's closet. That's him. Callie's hard voice had him glancing over his shoulder. Her face was pale against her straight dark hair. The puppy was on the floor now, playing with a stick. And he's still working out of the West LA Bureau. He turned in his seat to look at her. Do you remember their address? She flinched, then nodded. Yes. But they probably aren't still living there. There's only one way to know for sure, right? He rose and reached for the keys. We'll drive past the place, see if anyone is around. She hesitated. What about Charlie Sancho? Don't you think he's a more likely suspect? Wade gains nothing by shooting at me now all these years after I've run away. The statute of limitations on the rape of a minor was recently extended, so that victims can press charges up to their 40th birthday. He'd also heard that many lawyers attempt to force judges to go by the laws that were in place when the crime was committed. If that was the case, Callie wouldn't be able to press charges since the regular statute of limitations was 10 years from the time the victim became an adult. Maybe Wade has decided it's time to cut his losses by eliminating you as a possible threat. Callie crossed her arms over her chest, a defensive posture she frequently adopted. Kirby went over to sniff at the puppy, and Roscoe took that as an invitation to play. Kirby readily chased the pup around the small room. But Wade didn't succeed in raping me. Attempted sexual assault would fall under the same umbrella, although with less jail time. In this case, an attempted assault would ruin Stiller's career. He took a step toward her, holding out his hand. Please take a ride with me. Let's just see if he and your mother are even living there. What about Roscoe? She placed her small hand in his. He glanced at the puppy, who was rolling around on the floor. We'll take him with us. I assume he did his thing outside. He did. I think he was house-trained at one time. He seemed to know what was expected of him. She sighed, then said, Okay, I guess it won't hurt to drive out there. Her voice was curt, but her fingers clung to his. He longed to pull her into his arms, but he didn't want to make her feel uncomfortable, especially after hearing about how she'd barely escaped her stepfather's sexual abuse all those years ago. Thank you. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, then released it. Let's go. The traffic in LA was slightly better midday than during the early and late morning rush hours. Still, it took them 30 minutes to find the small house Callie had once shared with her mother and stepfather. As he drove closer, her visceral reaction of shrinking into herself made him wince. That's it. She pointed with a shaky finger at a small, white house. Roscoe lifted his head to peer out the window too. There was a one-car garage but no vehicle in the driveway. Did your mother have a job outside the home? She was a bank teller, but Wade hadn't wanted her to work after they were married. Callie's voice was stronger now, as if she'd wrestled her fear under control. That's where they met, at the bank. He nodded. How do you feel about going up to the door? She was silent for a long second. I don't see what good that will do. If your mother is still living there, she'll be glad to see you're alive. If she's not there, you ask how long ago your mother moved away. You make it sound so easy. I know it's not. He felt certain Stiller wasn't home. The place looked far too quiet. Hey, it's not a problem. You stay here with Roscoe and Kirby. I'll go. He pushed his driver's door open, but stopped when she grabbed his arm. No, wait. You don't know my mother. I'll do it. Are you sure? He was torn between admiring her courage and wishing he'd just kept his big mouth shut about asking her to go in the first place. The last thing he wanted to do was cause Callie any more distress. But they also needed to understand who was trying to kill her. And in his opinion, Wade Stiller had jumped to the top of the suspect list. No. But I'll do it anyway. She opened her door and slid out, still holding the puppy. Before she could take 2 steps, the front door of the White House opened, revealing a short, thin woman wearing a pair of slacks and a sweater, her hair cut in a chin-length bob. Even from here, he could see the resemblance between this woman and Callie. Helen looked thin and weary, moving with a stilted gait as if she'd injured herself. Or as if she'd been injured by her husband. Without so much as glancing in their direction, Callie's mother keyed in a code on the garage door, then went inside. Moments later, she was behind the wheel of a small white car, carefully backing out of the driveway. Without paying any attention to his SUV parked across the street, Helen Stiller drove away. Well? I guess that answers one question. Callie's voice was hoarse, her hands still shaking as she stroked Roscoe's fur. They still live here. Yeah. Her mother's automatic movements seemed to indicate this was a routine she did on a regular basis. Daily or weekly visits of some sort. Stay here while I check the place out. What if you get caught? I'm not breaking in, just taking a look around. He shut his door and headed across the street to the White House. He took a few minutes to look inside the windows, but didn't find anything exciting. One thing was clear, Helen kept a meticulously clean house. There wasn't a water glass, a stray slip of paper, an open book, or any other sign of someone living there. Moving around the back of the house, he checked the bedrooms. The master was also meticulously clean, and the next room was a home office. The last bedroom he thought may have been Callie's, although it was clearly a guest room now. Like the rest of the house, there was no indication that anyone had ever slept in there. Clearly, Helen Stiller had moved on with her life after losing her daughter. He personally couldn't fathom such a thing, but then again, it sounded like Helen had felt as if she didn't have any options. He hurried back to the SUV. "Well?" Callie asked as he slid in behind the wheel. "Did you find anything?" "Not really, other than there doesn't seem to be a single thing out of place in the entire house." He started the engine, glancing at her. "Was your mother always such a neat freak?" "No, that's all Wade." Callie turned away, staring at the house she'd run from so long ago. The puppy seemed to have a calming effect on her. Mom bowed to Wade's wishes. "Do you think he hurts her?" "I have no idea what their relationship is like these days. Back then, he verbally abused her but didn't strike out physically. Now, he easily could have escalated." Many abusers did escalate over time, especially when they didn't get caught or suffer any consequences. She seemed to be moving stiffly when she left the house. "I noticed that too." Her voice hitched a bit as she turned to face him. "I feel bad for her, but she's an adult who made her choices. I was only 16. If I had stayed, things would have only gotten worse." "I completely understand, Callie, and I don't blame you for leaving. I'm glad you were able to escape Wade's assault." He blamed her mother, but knew it couldn't have been easy for Helen working an entry-level job with a daughter to support. No, the real person at fault was Wade Stiller himself. A cop who viewed himself as above the law. He drummed his fingertips on the steering wheel as he drove through the quiet neighborhood. He'd chosen to check out the house rather than to follow Helen, assuming she was doing something simple like getting her hair or nails done, but now he wished he'd done the opposite. In the rearview mirror, he noticed an LAPD squad coming up behind him. An instant later, the red and blue lights began to flash. "Why are we being pulled over?" Callie asked, fear etched on her features. She clutched the puppy closer. "You didn't break the law." "I don't know." Bryce pulled over and reached for his wallet. He held his badge up to the driver's side window so the patrol cop could see it. "Callie, open the glove box, the registration is in there." "Do you think Wade had cameras around his house?" Callie rummaged in the glove box, then handed him the slip of paper. "Maybe he knows you were looking inside." "I didn't see any cameras." But he mentally kicked himself for not checking more closely. He lowered his window as the officer approached. "Hello, I'm LAPD Officer Bryce Flynn, and that's my K9 Kirby in the back. What can I do for you?" "Officer Flynn." The cop nodded, then peered past him to eye Callie and Roscoe. "What brings you to the neighborhood?" "Just driving through, checking out the area." "Oh, this is my girlfriend Callie, we're thinking of relocating here." "Hey, do you happen to know if there are any houses for sale around here?" "No, but isn't that what a real estate agent is for?" The cop took his registration and peered at it for all of 3 seconds before handing it back. There was a call about a suspicious vehicle in the area. These neighbors are good at keeping an eye out for anything out of the ordinary. Suspicious. Since when is checking out a neighborhood as a potential place to live suspicious? Bryce passed the vehicle registration to Callie. "Put that back in the glove box, would you, babe?" "Sure." Callie did as he'd asked. "Is that all?" Bryce pressed. "Pulling me over for simply being here is a stretch. Especially since I wasn't breaking any laws." "I'm following up on a complaint," the cop corrected. "But yes, that's all. Take care, Officer Flynn." Bryce watched the cop stride back to the squad. When the guy got back behind the wheel, he pulled away from the curb, making his way out of the subdivision. "That was creepy," Callie said in a low voice. "No kidding," he agreed. Either Stiller had hidden cameras that had shown him peering into the windows, or Callie's mother had noticed them sitting there and called it in. Stiller seemed the type who would happily press charges for trespassing, but maybe his being a cop had thrown the patrol officer off. Either way, he was convinced Wade Stiller's paranoia was more than just wanting privacy. The man reeked of having something to hide. Chapter 5. The puppy wiggled in her arms as if tired of being confined. While Bryce had been looking in the windows of the house her mother shared with Wade, she'd put the puppy down on the ground. He'd gone to the bathroom again like a smart little boy, then rolled around on the ground in a playful mood. She really wanted to get a brush for him, and felt certain the poor thing already had fleas. Using Roscoe to avoid her current situation wasn't smart. She needed to stay focused, no matter how much she'd rather just play with the puppy. Someone had tried to kill her, and while Bryce had made some good points about why Wade could be the culprit, she just didn't see why he'd bother. Not 12 years after the fact. Callie? What? She set Roscoe on the floor at her feet. Did you say something? Did Wade try to find you after you ran away? Yes. I saw some flyers that I assume he and my mom put up. That was the main reason I left this area. She glanced at the neighborhood where she'd lived so briefly. I was most comfortable in other areas of the city, and to be honest, San Bernardino was my favorite. It's not that far from LA, Bryce said dryly. I know. She smiled as the puppy gnawed on her shoes, then added, I sincerely doubt Wade tried all that hard to find me. I think the flyers and media play were a show he put on for my mom and for his cop buddies, nothing more. All the more reason he may want to silence you now. He had a point, but she still had trouble imagining Wade hanging around outside the diner to shoot at her. That seemed more Charlie's style. Roscoe began gnawing on her toes through her shoes, so she picked him up again. Did you find anything on Charlie Sancho? Not yet, but I meant to ask you where the Death Rays used to hang out when they weren't at the warehouse. After the feds raided the warehouse, they never returned. She thought about that for a moment. Otto used to hang at a bar called the Slammer. The guy who owns it thinks it's funny for people to say they're going to the Slammer, like hanging out in jail. Charming name, Bryce said wryly. He used the SUV's GPS to find the location. Then he frowned. It's not that far from Darla's diner. That was news to her. She buried her fingers in Roscoe's fur. Okay, but I hardly think any bar is open at 7 o'clock in the morning. Charlie couldn't have been at the bar, then decided to walk over to the diner to shoot at me. He could if he's friends with the owner. Or he could have seen you coming or going from the diner. Once he knew your schedule, he could easily take you out of the picture, maybe even hiding in the bar afterward. Bryce glanced at her as he turned the SUV around. I'll drop you off at the motel first, then head over to check out the bar. She didn't like the idea of Bryce leaving her behind. But at the same time, she wasn't keen on going to the Slammer either. Are you sure you'll recognize Charlie? No, but I'll keep my eyes open for a man with a deformed ear. The Death Rays hang out in groups, so I'm sure someone will call him by name. Guilt pricked at her skin. It felt wrong to have Bryce heading into a possible biker bar without backup on her behalf. You won't fit in, Bryce. They're going to know you're a cop. Maybe, but I can at least find out if Charlie Sancho has been hanging out there. It's a place to start. Take Kirby with you. She glanced back at the K9. The dog had his nose pressed against the crate as if he wanted to be up front with her and Roscoe. Kirby will be a good deterrent. No one will make a move against you with him at your side. Bryce frowned. I'd rather leave Kirby with you. I have Roscoe. Not that the puppy would be any protection against an intruder. Besides, no one knows where we're staying, right? You should be safe at the motel, but if a fellow cop is involved... He grimaced and sighed. I'm not willing to take a chance with your life. His concern was sweet, and for a moment she was reminded of Brent Green, the young man who'd tried to help shield her and Ava from the Death Rays. Somehow Simon, the leader of the gang, must have found out about Brent Green because one night Brent hadn't come home. When she and Ava had gone looking for him, they found him dead in the alley behind their apartment building, stabbed in his throat. The memory made her shiver. If something like that happened to either Bryce or Kirby, she'd never forgive herself. What is it? Bryce reached over to touch her arm. You look upset. She'd always had trouble hiding her feelings. I really think it would be better for you to take me to San Bernardino rather than to find Charlie Sancho or Wade Stiller. I don't want anyone else to be hurt on my behalf. Who else was hurt on your behalf? A man named Brent Green helped me and Ava back in April of this year. Then he was found dead in the alley. He was stabbed in the throat. She turned to look at him. A clear message from the death rays. I'm sorry about your friend, but that was back when the death rays were working in full force. Bryce smiled reassuringly. Keep in mind, several of their members were killed, and another dozen have been tossed in jail, including Simon Normandy. The death rays are not the threat they used to be. Someone tried to shoot me twice, she pointed out. And if that was Charlie, he's not going to just walk away. Especially not if he killed Otto. Yeah, it's not clear to me how Otto's murder plays into this, Bryce admitted. I really thought the killer must be a victim of some criminal act Otto was responsible for. I didn't knowingly commit a crime with Otto. Although she couldn't deny Otto could have easily done any number of things, including armed robbery. She thought back to some of their trips outside of LA. Was it possible Otto had held someone up at gunpoint, leaving the gas station, and joining her on the motorcycle without her realizing what he'd done? Maybe. But even if he had, how could that victim have found her and Otto after all this time? That scenario seemed to be a stretch. Bryce didn't say anything more as he turned down the street where their motel was located. Roscoe was getting antsy again. Once Bryce parked the SUV, she slid out and let the puppy down to do his thing. Roscoe ran right back to where she'd found him, squatted to pee, then bounded back toward her. He jumped up and down, waiting for Kirby to be let out of the back hatch. The two dogs raced around for a bit, making her smile. They were fun to watch. How much did flea and tick medicine cost? And a dog brush? Using her meager stash of cash for Roscoe went against her survival instincts, but she was tempted to find a pet supply store anyway. Once she'd been a master at shoplifting, stealing, whatever you wanted to call it. Not something she was proud of, but a skill born out of necessity while living on the street. Glancing at Bryce, she knew he'd be upset if she did such a thing now. You stay here with Roscoe and Kirby. I'll head over to the Slammer. On the way back, I'll pick up some pet supplies for the little guy. She stared at him for a long moment. Had he read her mind? You will? Yes. Look, everyone knows California has a stray dog problem, so it's likely no one is searching for the puppy. But if we do hear of someone looking for him, we'll need to return him to his rightful owner, okay? It's a deal. Thanks, Bryce. She picked Roscoe up and carried him inside the motel room. Kirby followed. Returning Roscoe to his rightful owner was the right thing to do. But she couldn't deny hoping that his owner was gone and never coming back. The way Callie looked at that puppy made his heart squeeze in his chest. He needed to make sure the puppy didn't belong to anyone before she lost her heart to the little guy more than she had already. It gave him an idea. He took a picture of Roscoe with his phone and decided to use the dog as a reason to chat with the patrons in the Slammer. Not that any of the people hanging around inside the bar would be likely dog owners, but he could find an angle to make it work. Don't open the door to anyone, he told Callie sternly. I don't plan to, since no one I know would even bother to search for me here. She scooped Roscoe into her arms. Guess what? It's bath time, little dude. He left her to it, heading back outside. The chilly air was only slightly warmed by the afternoon sun. He slid in behind the wheel and pulled out of the parking lot. He would have walked, but he would need the vehicle to get the pet supplies Callie needed. Scary how much he wanted to make her happy. He made a quick call to his boss, letting Grossman know there was another attempt on Callie. Grossman had already heard about the shooting at Callie's apartment, but it had taken place outside the West LA jurisdiction. Grossman agreed to see if the West Valley District would let them take over the investigation. Are you sure she's safe? Grossman asked. I have her at the green tree. We're safe for now. He saw the bar up ahead. I gotta go. I'll check back later. Roger that, Grossman agreed. The bar was only 5 minutes from the motel, but it took him 3 times that long to find a parking spot. Thankfully, one opened just 1 block away from his destination. He left the SUV at the curb, then strode toward the door. Music blared from inside the bar. No music in prison, but hey, he wasn't the one who chose to name a bar after a slang term for jail. 2 men walked out as he approached the door, and he raised his hand holding his cell phone. Hey, can I ask if either of you knows anything about this lost puppy my wife found? He aimed for a reassuring smile. We found him just down the road a bit. I don't know anything about a dog, the taller of the 2 men said curtly before turning away. Are you sure? Bryce persisted. Neither man fit Callie's description of Sancho. Both of their ears looked normal enough. Will you just look at his picture? My wife wants to keep him, but not if his owner is out looking for him. Get lost, the shorter guy muttered harshly. Bryce watched them go, raking his gaze over the pair. They were dressed head to toe in leather, which made him think they may have once been associated with the death rays. Or maybe they still were. Just because Simon was in jail didn't mean one of the other guys hadn't stepped up to take charge. Hard to believe they'd still be involved in drug running after the feds had busted up their pipeline to Mexico. Yet he also knew there was always another Mexican drug lord ready, willing, and able to step in to fill the gap. The greed of the Mexican cartels was the primary reason they were losing the war against drugs. Kirby had been cross-trained as a narcotic sniffing dog, but he was better suited for chasing and apprehending suspects. If Kirby was with him now, he had no doubt the K9 would have alerted to the drugs he felt certain were freely available inside. Bryce stepped inside the slammer. He got several curious looks, which he ignored as he threaded his way to the bar. He flagged the bartender, who looked like he may have once been with the Death Rays or some other motorcycle gang. Excuse me, do you know anything about a stray puppy? He smiled sheepishly and held up his phone screen to display Roscoe's picture. We found him nearby and thought his owner might be looking for him. No. I've never seen him. The guy stared at him. Do you want something to drink? A beer, make it a Bud Light. He didn't much like beer, but figured it was better to fit in. After the bartender slid a chilled can toward him, he said, "That will be $10. Bryce dropped a $20 bill on the bar, then waved his hand at the crowd. Do you think there's anyone here who may have lost a puppy? The bartender smirked. Doubt it. Using Roscoe as an excuse had gotten him inside, but he knew the charade wouldn't last long. There wasn't a single man in the place who seemed like the kind to have a puppy. He pretended to sip his beer as he ran his gaze over the patrons, looking specifically for a damaged ear. Everyone within view wore leather, sported tattoos, but also had 2 relatively normal-looking ears. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it may be too early for Sancho. Granted, there were plenty of other biker types milling about. Unfortunately, he knew nothing about the personal schedule of Charlie, the loner with a gnawed ear. He set his beer back on the bar. Catching the bartender's gaze, he asked, "If I brought a flyer in, would you put it up someplace? My wife really has her heart set on keeping this puppy." "So keep it," the bartender snapped. "I'm not putting up a flyer for you. No one cares about a stray dog." Okay. He made a show of slipping his phone back into his pocket. "Just thought I'd ask." The bartender had taken the 20 without bringing any change. He turned and rested his back against the edge of the bar. He could tell a couple of the men closest to him had overheard his conversation with the bartender, but they didn't approach or ask about the dog. How long should he stay? Based on the looks he was getting, not long. He pushed away from the bar, heading toward the door. After 2 steps he paused, then changed direction to head to the men's room. Charlie Sancho with the grossly deformed ear had just entered the bar. Bryce tried to move with nonchalance, hoping his abrupt turn hadn't raised suspicion. He chided himself for not being more patient. 5 minutes later, he left the bathroom. He stood for a moment out of view from the bartender to pinpoint Sancho's location. There, off to the side talking with two men near a pool table, where a few other guys were engrossed in a game. For a loner, he seemed awfully chatty. Was Callie wrong about Sancho, or had he changed over time? He watched for another minute before crossing back to the bar to pick up his beer. This time he carried it with him as he went over to watch the game of pool. Sancho didn't appear to notice him standing there. Bryce eased a little closer, trying to overhear what they were saying. He also pulled out his phone so he'd have an excuse to talk to Charlie and his buddies about the puppy. There were cops crawling all over the place, Charlie said. So what? It doesn't matter. Were they discussing the shooting at the diner and at Callie's apartment building? It seemed likely. Was someone here involved? Or were they simply concerned about cops being so close to the slammer? What do you want? A low, harsh voice startled him. He instantly turned to face the man who'd come up behind him. His chest tightened when he recognized one of the two men who'd overheard his conversation with the bartender. Bryce had left his gun in the glove box of his car, fearing it would only peg him as a cop. "You know what I'm doing," he said with a frown. "I told the bartender. I found a puppy, and I'm looking for his owner. No one in here gives a rip about your stupid dog." The guy's voice was low and menacing. "You look and smell like a pig. Time for you to get lost." So much for not coming across as a cop. Bryce schooled his features into annoyance. "I'm not a cop. I'm just some poor schmuck trying to make his wife happy by giving her a puppy for Christmas. You don't know anything about this little guy." He waved the phone around. "Fine. But don't insult me." Charlie Sancho turned to stare at him. The two guys he'd been talking to did the same. For a brief second, Bryce wondered if Charlie somehow knew he was a cop. Bryce didn't cower, knowing that would be like dumping blood in the water with the way the sharks were swirling around him. He returned their gaze defiantly, until Sancho turned away. "Whatever." Bryce scowled. "I'm outta here." "And don't come back," the guy behind him said. He dropped his full beer on the closest table, then headed for the door. The high level of animosity was unusual, but he chalked that up to being a biker bar. Maybe they were breaking all kinds of laws, either dealing drugs, finding prostitutes, or gambling. It could be why they didn't like the cops being so close. Outside, he turned toward his SUV. Hearing the bar door slam behind him, he spun to face the potential threat. The two bikers who'd overheard him at the bar were striding toward him. The only weapon he carried was his MK3 knife, a lethal blade preferred by the SEAL teams. In an instant, he pulled the knife from beneath his quilted jacket. The two men abruptly stopped. "I'm not a cop, but I was a Navy SEAL for 15 years, Bryce said. "I can take you both down without breaking a sweat." The bikers looked at each other, a hint of wariness darkening their gazes. Even they would know it wasn't smart to mess with a SEAL. "Turn around and walk away," Bryce repeated. "If we fight, someone will call the cops. Neither one of us wants that." "Stay away from the slammer," the taller of the two growled. "Yeah, sure." Bryce held his ground as the two men turned away. He watched as they disappeared back inside the bar. Once he was satisfied there weren't more following in their footsteps, he turned to head back to his SUV. This time he moved warily, pausing at the corner of the building to clear the alley before continuing on his way. But when he reached the SUV, he went stock still. The windshield was smashed to smithereens and all four tires had been slashed. His ruse hadn't worked. The bikers hadn't guessed he was a cop, they'd already known it. But how? A chill snaked down his spine. He took a moment to look for his Sig Sauer, sending up a prayer of thanks that it hadn't been stolen. He slipped the holster onto his belt, then broke into a run, desperate to get back to the motel to make sure Callie was safe. Chapter 6. Bathing Roscoe in the bathtub was an adventure. By the time she'd finished, they were both soaked. After drying herself and the puppy off with towels, she'd broken down and used her own comb to pick through his matted fur. When she finished, little Roscoe looked much better. Kirby watched the bathing event with dark, curious eyes. When Roscoe jumped up and tried to nip at him, Kirby easily took charge. The puppy soon figured out which of them was the alpha male, and it wasn't Roscoe. At least the pup was house-trained. He went over to the door when he needed to go outside. Callie opened the motel door just enough to look around first before stepping outside with Roscoe. Kirby followed, clearly on guard. Watching Roscoe made her smile. She wanted to keep the puppy so badly, but she knew having Roscoe long-term would be impossible, especially if she ended up living on the street. It wouldn't be the first time or the last. Going back to the Lizard Lounge would be one step in the right direction, though. The job hadn't been too bad, and Pedro, the owner, was a nice man who had agreed to pay his serving staff in cash. Her tips had been decent. Still, Roscoe deserved better. Veterinary fees were expensive, and she had no idea if he'd had all his immunizations yet or not. The puppy was also full of energy. No way could she leave him alone for the long hours she was forced to work just to make ends meet. Feeding him was another consideration. If Roscoe grew to be even half the size of Kirby, she'd be in trouble. Okay, keeping him was not an option. Better she came to grips with that realization now, rather than keep dwelling on it. She'd just enjoy Roscoe while she could. The puppy continued playing with Kirby. At one point, the canine looked over at her as if to say, "Can't you make him stop?" She had to give the older dog credit for not just biting Roscoe to put him in his place. When Kirby was done playing, he let Roscoe know. The puppy then wandered over to play with her. When the chilly air got to be too much, she headed back inside. She'd never owned a television, but now that there was one available, she used the remote to turn it on. Flipping through the channels, she realized she hadn't missed much by not having a television and access to cable. It didn't take long for her to become bored by the talking heads on both the news and the daytime shows. There was a movie on one channel, but it was already half over, and she was having trouble following the convoluted plot. She shut the thing off and sat in silence. Roscoe fell asleep on the bed next to her. Kirby was stretched out in front of the door, his head between his paws. It made her feel safe knowing no one would get past him. Her thoughts drifted back to her mother. Seeing her earlier had been a shock. 12 years had passed since she'd spoken to her mother. She hated to secretly admit she had no desire to talk to her now. Not if she was still living and breathing under Wade's thumb. Her heart ached, though, for what she'd lost. Once she and her mother had been close. But those days were long gone. Kirby abruptly shot to his feet, his ears perked forward. The canine didn't bark or growl, so she had to assume the dog knew who was outside. Sure enough, a moment later, the door to the room opened. Kirby's tail wagged back and forth with enthusiasm as he greeted Bryce. "Good boy, aren't you a good boy?" Bryce took a moment to pet the dog, then turned a serious gaze toward her. "We need to leave." "What? Why?" Her heart thundered in her chest as she tried to understand what had happened. Her instincts, though, had her gathering her meager things together and placing them into her battered suitcase. "My SUV was vandalized, it's not operable." She blinked. "I don't understand, who would do that?" "I think the death rays are onto me. Onto both of us. Get your stuff, I've arranged for a replacement ride, but we'll need to be ready to go." Without waiting for a response, he crossed the threshold between the connecting rooms. As she finished packing her bag, she could hear Bryce doing the same. Roscoe woke up and jumped down from the bed, rolling as he hit the ground. Then he looked around in confusion, as if not understanding what had just happened. Despite the seriousness of their situation, the puppy's antics made her smile. She set her suitcase near the door. A few minutes later, Bryce joined her, a computer bag over his shoulder and supplies for Kirby packed into a duffel. His expression was grim as he stood near the door. "Where are we picking up this replacement vehicle?" She wondered how far they'd have to walk carrying all their stuff, and Roscoe too. "Caleb is meeting us a few blocks away." "Who?" She echoed in confusion. "He's a Navy SEAL friend of Nico Ramirez," he explained. "You met him the night I rescued you from the death rays." "Oh yeah." She remembered now, although she'd met a whole group of guys that night, too many to remember their individual names. Nico was the only one she really remembered, and that was because he'd obviously been in love with Ava. And her friend had returned the sentiment. Bryce peered through the window, then opened the door. "Let's go. The rendezvous location isn't too far." She scooped Roscoe into her arms, then reached for her suitcase. Bryce beat her to it. "You've got everything else," she protested. "I can handle it." His voice was clipped. "Stay close behind me." "Okay." She gave in, knowing they could move faster this way. Bryce set a quick pace, cutting around the back of the motel to take a different street. Keeping up with him wasn't too difficult, she was in decent shape. Yet she couldn't believe how fast he was with all the gear he carried. They continued moving for almost 15 minutes before he slowed, then came to a stop. Roscoe wiggled in her arms, wanting down. She bent over to release him so that he could do his thing. She decided his bladder was the size of a pea, for all the bathroom breaks he took. "See that gas station over there?" Bryce gestured with his hand. When she nodded, he said, "That's where we're meeting Caleb." With a nod, she picked Roscoe up. "Lead on." They reached the gas station without difficulty. The way Bryce kept searching for signs of trouble made her do the same. He'd mentioned the death rays were onto him. After her solid 2 months of living with the motorcycle gang, she figured she could spot a death ray from a mile away. Thankfully, there was no one behind them. When she headed toward the convenience store, Bryce held her back. "We need to stay out of sight from the cameras." "We do." She frowned. "That seems a bit much. The death rays don't have the ability to get video from these types of places. No business owner would cooperate with a bunch of biker thugs. Call me paranoid, but we can't rule out the police being involved." Bryce urged her toward the side of the gas station building. "Once we have a replacement vehicle, we'll need a new plan." She wasn't sure what the old plan had entailed, but didn't ask. "I think the plan should be to drive away from here, to go somewhere I can stay off-grid." Bryce shot her a look of frustration. "Aren't you tired of running?" "Yes, but we just ran from the motel, so what's the difference?" She leaned wearily against the wall. "All I've done is drag you into danger." "I saw Charlie Sancho at the Slammer. There were several death rays there, and I was quickly warned to stay away from the bar. Then I found my SUV trashed. The only good thing is the vandals didn't find my Sig Sauer in my glove box." He momentarily rested his hand on his weapon. "They knew I was a cop, Callie. Probably because my SUV was parked at Darla's diner. I know I suspected your stepfather, but it's looking more like the shooter is one of the death rays. Whoever took the shot reported back to the others about my being there." She stared at him for a long moment. "You think one of those death rays knew you were a cop based on what had happened back in September, when you and the other SEALs took them on?" "Yes." He sighed and said, "I wish I could say for sure Charlie Sancho was the shooter, but I can't. Honestly, it could be any of them. They stick together like bees in a hive." The image almost made her smile. But then she straightened. Maybe Charlie Sancho is the queen bee. As in their new leader. "That's an interesting theory," Bryce admitted. "Do you think he's eliminating the old leadership team? Anyone like Otto, who was close to Simon?" "Maybe." She shivered in the chilly air. It was easy enough to imagine Sancho murdering Otto, but coming after her. That part still didn't sit well. She didn't understand how getting rid of the old guard meant killing her too. Bryce watched the vehicles coming into the gas station like a hawk. When he recognized Caleb behind the wheel of a black SUV, he sent up a silent prayer of thanks. God was watching over them big time. Caleb nodded in recognition and immediately drove over to where they stood. "Hey Bryce. Merry Christmas." The holiday was only a couple of days away, but he'd been so preoccupied by the danger, he'd forgotten all about it over the past few hours. "Merry Christmas, Caleb." He stepped forward to shake his hand. He admired the way the SEALs had worked together to free Ava and Callie from the death rays. Humbling how Caleb had agreed without hesitation to help now. Thanks, I owe you big time for this. Nah, we're a team. Caleb flashed a smile at Callie. He arched an eyebrow when he noticed the puppy. Looks like you have your hands full. This is Roscoe, we found him outside the motel. Callie moved forward but didn't offer her hand. Nice to meet you again, Caleb. I'm glad to be here. Caleb surprised him by pulling a wad of bills from his pocket. I brought more cash in case you were running low. You didn't have to do that, Bryce protested. He'd only asked for a replacement SUV and help in getting his damaged one towed to the closest garage. I know what it's like to be on the run. Caleb regarded him steadily. Take it. If you don't need it all, you can always return whatever is left. But it's yours if you need it. No need to repay it either. Bryce hesitated, then reluctantly accepted the money. Thanks, Caleb. I think the Death Rays are trying to rebuild their gang. We have reason to believe that a man named Charlie Sancho is running the show now that Simon is in jail. Caleb frowned. How many of them are left? We took a big chunk of Death Rays out of commission back in September, but there was a dozen in a bar called the Slammer and likely more hanging out somewhere else. Bryce rubbed the back of his neck. I would estimate they have at least 20 members left. And possibly more have been recruited to join. Do you want help? Caleb offered. Charlotte is picking me up, but I can tell her to go back home. When they'd worked together in September, he remembered hearing about Caleb's wife Charlotte being pregnant. As much as he'd welcome backup, he felt guilty putting Caleb in danger. Providing me a new set of wheels is more than enough, Caleb. Not to mention the extra cash, too. It's a huge relief to have an SUV that's untraceable back to me. I can take it from here. Okay, but I'm only a phone call away. Caleb clapped him on the back, then tossed the car keys. Bryce grabbed them midair. The only thing that might hold me back is if Charlotte goes into labor. She's not due for 4 more weeks, but after Ava delivered Jane 6 weeks early, she's expecting to give birth early too. Congrats. Let me know when the baby arrives so I can meet the newest member of the family. Bryce kept his tone casual, ignoring the twinge in his gut. His own wife had died a little over 3 years ago from an aggressive brain tumor. He'd made his peace with God over taking Sarah, but hearing all the SEALs talk about their respective families brought back the painful memories. And his guilt over the way he'd remained with the SEALs despite Sarah's diagnosis. He truly thought that she'd be fine after treatment. Instead, she died alone. His guilt had been a constant companion for years. It was only recently that he'd managed to forgive himself. Mostly. He still occasionally awoke sweating, his voice hoarse from silent screams from the reoccurring nightmare where Sarah called out to him in pain, only he was swimming through an endless ocean, unable to reach to her in time. Bryce? Are you okay? He'd pulled himself together. This wasn't the time to get tangled up in his past. Yeah, fine. Thanks again, Caleb. Appreciate the vehicle and the cash. Callie, are you ready? Sure. She looked at him curiously as if sensing he'd zoned off. Which he had. Not good. He was a cop and a former Navy SEAL. He needed to be on high alert for trouble. He picked up her suitcase and stored it on the floor of the back seat. Then he tossed his duffel and computer bag in too. Lastly, he took Kirby to the back crate area. Thankfully, Caleb had known he'd need a secure place for his K9. It made him wonder where Sierra, Caleb's black lab, was, but then he saw a second SUV pull in with Charlotte behind the wheel and a large black dog in the back. Leaving Sierra with his pregnant wife was exactly what he'd have done. Better to have the dog there to protect his wife and unborn child than to let her stay back alone. He waved, then slid in behind the wheel. Callie was already sitting in the passenger seat, still cradling Roscoe. They were adorable together, and he wished more than anything he could figure out who was out to hurt Callie and why. She'd already suffered so much at the hands of evil men. If anyone deserved a chance to live her life without being threatened by a gunman, it was Callie Burgess. Do you think it's safe to stop back at the motel? He glanced at Callie in surprise. Why? She flushed. I left my comb in the bathroom. She grimaced, then waved her hand. Never mind, it's no big deal, I used it on Roscoe anyway. I'm sorry I didn't get to the pet supply store. They were stuck at an extremely long red light. We'll get you a new comb. I'd rather not go back to the motel. I understand. She stroked the puppy. Better to be safe than sorry. I should have anticipated they'd track me down. He couldn't hide his frustration. But I think this latest incident proves the threat is from the death rays, not your stepfather. She nodded. Seems that way. He still wanted to rule Wade out as a possible suspect, but that would have to wait until they'd found a new place to stay. He was torn between going somewhere out of the LA area and wanting to stay to be close to the death rays. Maybe he needed to call his boss, Sergeant Grossman, again. Sarge was a decent guy and would want to know what Bryce had stumbled into with the death rays. Especially since he'd need to call off work for the next 2 days. He wasn't sure who was working the Otto Redmond case, but they should probably know about the bikers hanging out at the slammer. The light finally turned green, enabling him to move slowly forward. The traffic was seriously backed up now, presumably because the time was approaching rush hour. Many a driver sought to abandon the freeway to travel home via side streets. They were sitting at yet another side street when Callie said, "Isn't that a pet supply store over there?" "Good eye. We may as well stop now. Maybe we can get on a less busy street when we leave the place." "Thanks, Bryce." "It's no trouble, I promised." He didn't need her gratitude, but he had to admit, the way she ditched the giant chip she'd worn on her shoulder during their first meeting was nice. It took another 5 minutes just to get close enough to pull into the pet supply parking lot. Minutes later, they were inside the store, Callie carrying Roscoe and Bryce leading Kirby on leash. As they moved up and down the aisles, the items in the shopping cart grew exponentially. When it came time to check out, Callie audibly gasped at the cost. "We have to put some of this back." She began randomly pulling items from the cart. "Roscoe doesn't need all of this." "Yes, he does." He put a hand on her arm. "It's okay, Callie. I know what it's like to pay for a dog." "I had no idea it would cost this much," she whispered. "Trust me, I know. I had sticker shock the first time too." He smiled and paid the bill. Callie looked crestfallen as they headed back to the SUV. He wanted to ask why she was so upset. After all, he hadn't minded paying the tab. His thoughts were interrupted by a loud explosion reverberating through the air. He abruptly stopped, putting a hand on Callie's arm as he raked his gaze over the area. A plume of smoke rose from the direction they'd recently come from. Bryce had no idea what had happened. The blast could have been from anything. Yet every instinct in his body insisted they needed to get out of there right away. "Hurry! Get inside the SUV." He hastened to store their pet supplies in the back seat, then placed Kirby in the crated area. Once they were ready to go, he headed in the opposite direction from the blast. The wail of sirens grew louder as first responders rushed to the area. "What was that?" Callie asked. "I don't know." He tuned the radio to a news station. After a few minutes, his worst fears were confirmed. A reporter announced that the Green Tree Motel where he and Callie had been staying was the source of the explosion. Chapter 7. A bomb had gone off at the motel. Callie couldn't wrap her mind around the information broadcasted on the news. She looked at Bryce, who grimaced and said, "Yeah, not good." Talk about an understatement. She tried to gather her scattered thoughts. "Do you think the death rays thought we were still at the motel?" "They must have." He took as many turns to get away from the area as the traffic allowed. Still, their progress was painfully slow. She couldn't help twisting in her seat to look for any sign of motorcycles coming up behind them. It's the only explanation. Especially since the motel was walking distance to the slammer. "I hope no one was hurt," she whispered, stroking Roscoe to keep calm. "I'll feel terrible if someone died in that blast because of me. If anyone was hurt, it's because of the bomber, not either of us." Bryce reached over to take her hand. I should have found a place further away from their hangout. The good news is that we had connecting rooms at the motel. Hopefully, the impact was minimal. I pray you're right. Praying wasn't part of her usual routine, but she also knew how much Bryce leaned on his faith. The more time she spent with him, the more she thought he was right about God watching over them. Humbling to realize she'd be dead by now, if it wasn't for God sending Bryce and Kirby to protect her. Charlie Sancho must be the one behind these attempts. She clung to Bryce's hand, unwilling to let him go. You need to call your boss and let him know about the explosion at the motel. Maybe there is evidence Charlie and the other death rays left behind that will help convict him. I will, I was just thinking of that too. Bryce glanced over at her, managing a wan smile. I'm glad we left when we did. Yes? She wanted to throw herself into his arms, but of course, that wasn't an option while he was driving. She drew in a deep breath to calm her racing heart. And that we found Roscoe before the explosion too. Bryce nodded, falling silent as they drove. After what seemed like an eternity, he left the road to pull into a fast food drive-through lane. With 2 dogs, it's better to grab food to go. There's a motel a few blocks from here we can try. Okay. She would be glad to get out of the car for a bit. Especially since Roscoe was getting antsy. How far from the slammer are we? Roughly 12 miles. He shrugged. I don't think it should be a problem since Caleb provided us a clean SUV. Another 10 minutes passed before they had their food and were on their way to the motel. It was similar to the previous motel, and she felt a little guilty knowing danger might very well follow them. How, she wasn't sure, but at this point she wasn't about to take anything for granted. While Bryce went inside to get their rooms, she let Roscoe out to do his thing. He complied, wagging his tail excitedly when she praised him for being a good boy. Bryce returned a few minutes later. We have connecting rooms again. We should feed the dogs before we eat. Thank you. His consideration for her privacy was sweet. As she secretly watched him, she realized Bryce was one of the good guys. An honest man, a good cop, and someone she could depend on to do the right thing. She could count on one hand the number of men she knew who matched those criteria. Brent Green was one of them, and he'd died for his efforts. Pedro, her boss at the Lizard Lounge, was another. Her father too, but he had been gone for 13 years now. She thought for a moment, but couldn't come up with anyone else. A total of 4 trustworthy men. It was a pathetic testimony to her life. She should include the Navy SEALs that had come to help rescue her and Ava into the mix. Caleb and the others were very much like Bryce, in their gung-ho attitude and willingness to risk their lives to save hers and Ava's. Clearly, she needed to take her life in a new direction. Once the danger was over, that is. She didn't have a high school diploma, but she could get her GED. Living like a refugee was getting old. But she'd need to work as a server until she could get back on her feet financially. Not that she'd been successful at that so far. Callie? Bryce's husky voice broke into her depressing thoughts. Did you say something? He searched her gaze for a moment. I think Roscoe is finished. We'll need to feed the dogs, then eat before our food gets cold. Oh yes, of course. She sighed, realizing Roscoe was digging in the dirt. I gave you a bath, goofball. The puppy didn't seem to care. Inside, she used a towel to wipe off his paws, then set him on the floor. The puppy ran straight to Kirby, forcing Bryce to separate the 2 dogs long enough to feed them. Bryce already had their food unwrapped and set up on the table. She had to squeeze past him to sit in the chair. He held out his hand again. I'd like to say grace. She took his hand and bowed her head. Dear Lord, we ask you to comfort those who may have been hurt or lost their lives in the recent explosion. We know all things happen by your will, and seek your guidance as we follow your chosen path. We also thank you for protecting us from harm. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Tears pricked her eyes for some unknown reason. She swiped at them, hoping he wouldn't notice. Ah, Callie. Bryce stood and drew her upward. Then he hugged her close. I'm sorry this has been such a rough day. She buried her face against his chest for a moment, listening to the reassuring beat of his heart. She wondered if it was God's will that had brought them together again. She wasn't worthy, but she was thankful to be alive. With a sigh, she lifted her head and pulled away enough to look up at him. You're a good man, Bryce. I'm sorry I treated you unfairly back in September. That's the second time you've accused me of being a good man, he said wryly, his green gaze boring into hers. You wouldn't say that if you knew how badly I want to kiss you. She gulped at the banked desire in his eyes. It matched the heat in her belly. She smiled. I'm not stopping you. His gaze grew even more intense as he gently pulled her close. He slowly lowered his head to hers, giving her plenty of time to back out of the embrace. She didn't. He kissed like he did everything else in his life, with a confident intensity. Instantly she was lost in his embrace, kissing him back with enthusiasm. His kiss was better than anything she could have imagined, making her secretly wish she'd met Bryce Flynn before her life had spiraled out of control. Because she knew that this, whatever it was, couldn't last. That's just not how things happened for her. Once the danger was over, she'd be back on her own. Bryce would have happily spent the next hour kissing Callie, but he didn't want to scare her. And they needed to eat. Plus Kirby was getting annoyed with Roscoe, swatting at the puppy with his large paw. He gently broke away from the kiss but rested his forehead on hers for a moment. That was far better than I ever imagined. She laughed, a husky sound that sent more shivers of awareness down his spine. As if he didn't want her enough already. For me too. If she kept saying things like that, they'd never eat. He lifted his head and offered a crooked smile. Our food is getting cold. It wouldn't be the first time I ate cold food. She stepped back and dropped into the chair. At least this one isn't from a dumpster. He winced at the repugnant thought. Don't say things like that. She shrugged and took a bite of her burger. Her casual attitude bothered him. Clearly, she had in fact eaten out of a dumpster. No big surprise since he knew she'd lived on the street. Kirby barked and growled at Roscoe again, so he lifted the puppy into his lap before sitting across from Callie and taking a bite of his sandwich. Will you call your boss when we're finished? He nodded, eyeing her thoughtfully. For someone who doesn't trust the police, you seem anxious for me to do that. What else can we do? Her brow furrowed. You can't take on the death rays alone. They've already destroyed your SUV and blew up a motel. I don't even want to consider what might come next. I won't let anything happen to you, Callie. I appreciate that, but you must realize we can't jump from one motel to the next forever. She hesitated, then added, I'm sure you want to celebrate Christmas with your family. Sarah's face flashed in his mind's eye. I don't have a family. I lost my wife, Sarah, over 3 years ago. Her blue eyes widened in surprise. No doubt she hadn't realized he'd been married. I'm sorry to hear that. I was overseas when she passed away. He forced himself to meet her gaze. More proof that I'm not the great guy you claim I am. It wasn't your fault you were deployed, she protested. Oh yes, it was. I could have used her diagnosis to get a compassionate discharge, but I didn't. He hated admitting how selfish he'd been. I loved being a SEAL and didn't want to quit. I convinced myself she'd be fine, that the treatments would help. Except she wasn't fine. Because they didn't help. I'm sure your wife understood. He shook his head. I doubt it. By the time I was finished with our mission and had a chance to talk to her, she was pretty bad. I immediately flew home, but she was gone before I got there. She knew how much you loved her, Callie insisted. That brief call they'd had before Sarah had died was the only good thing he'd done. He had told her how much he loved her, how sorry he was that he wasn't there, and that he'd be there ASAP. He'd begged her to hang on and wait for him. But God had other plans, mainly ending Sarah's pain while forcing Bryce to understand he'd made the wrong decision and put his own needs above his wife. Callie finished her burger, stood, then bent to give him a hug. The fact that you're telling me all this only reinforces how you are a great guy. He hoped she didn't have a bad case of hero worship. His feet were made of clay, just like everyone else's. She took Roscoe from him and went over to one of the dog toys they'd purchased earlier. After quickly finishing his meal, he pulled out his cell phone and called his boss. Sergeant Grossman. Hey Sarge, it's me again. What do you know about the explosion at the Green Tree Motel? For having a day off, you're sure involved in stuff, Grossman groused. What's up with the Green Tree? I was staying there with a friend. We left about an hour before the place went up in smoke. Why would you be at a motel? There was an edge of suspicion in his boss's tone. Don't tell me you were with a prostitute. No. He moved across the threshold to the next room. Come on, Sarge, you know me better than that. I'm with Callie, you know, from the restaurant. I told you, she's in trouble. This is the third attempt on her life, and I think she's in danger from the death rays. Didn't we bust them up a few months back? Grossman asked. After the shootout. Yes, but we didn't get everyone. I have reason to suspect a guy named Charlie Sancho is taking over as the leader of the gang. Finally, he had Grossman's attention. Charlie Sancho. Bryce filled him in on what had gone down at the Slammer and the subsequent damage to his SUV. The motel was within walking distance of those places. I think Sancho or one of the other death rays must have bribed the clerk to find out we were staying there. Thankfully, we'd already left. Grossman's fingers clacked on a keyboard. Looks like Sancho did time for armed robbery about 8 years ago. He's been out for 3 years now. 5 years for armed robbery? The jail sentences were getting shorter and shorter, likely due to the number of inmates in their overcrowded prisons. He dialed back his annoyance. I saw Sancho at the Slammer. And when I left the place, 2 death rays followed me out to warn me off. They nailed me as a cop. I insisted I was a SEAL, not a police officer. Probably the same thing to them, Grossman muttered. Okay, and you're sure this is all about Callie? What's her full name again? After a moment's hesitation, he said, Yes, Callie Burgess. You may not know because she didn't stick around, but we rescued her from the death rays in September. I think they're coming back to finish the job. First firing the shot at the diner, then at her apartment, and now the motel. I also think it's possible that Sancho had Otto Redmond killed. You have any proof to back up your theory? Not yet. It's been all I can manage to keep Callie alive. Which is why I'm calling you, Sarge. I need a pair of detectives to help with the evidence. Whoever is assigned to the Otto Redmond case should backtrack and help investigate the shooting at Darla's diner. From there, they should try to get something from my SUV, it's been towed. And from the explosion at the Green Tree Motel. Gee, thanks for telling me how to do my job, Grossman said wryly. Sorry, boss, it's been a long day. And I won't make it in to work tomorrow either. Grossman sighed heavily. Okay, that's fine. But you better keep me in the loop moving forward. What do you know about this Callie Burgess anyway? I see she has a criminal record for theft and drugs. Can you trust her? She's the victim, and those arrests were over 9 years ago, so yes, I trust her. Okay then. It looks like there's already 2 detectives working on the Otto Redmond case. I'll add the shootings, the bombing, and your SUV to their plate. Hey, gotta go, the brass just walked in. Grossman abruptly disconnected from the call. He'd wanted to ask which detectives had the Otto Redmond case, but hadn't been given a chance. He shot off a quick text to Grossman, asking for their names so he could communicate with them as needed. He doubted Wade Stiller was one of them, and even if he was, the guy likely wouldn't recognize Callie now after all these years. Grossman didn't answer. Bryce figured once Sarge was finished with the brass, he'd hear back about the detectives. In the meantime, he and Callie were safe here. Kirby had followed him into the room, no doubt to escape Roscoe. He bent to scratch Kirby's ears. Time for you to get some playtime, huh boy? Kirby's ears perked up, and his tail wagged with excitement. One of the reasons he'd chosen this place was that it wasn't far from a small playground. He crossed over to let Callie know where he was going, his heart melting when he found her cradling the puppy. Remembering their heart-stopping kiss held him frozen in place. Callie was only with him out of necessity, but he was fast losing his cool over her. Hero worship wasn't a good foundation for a relationship, and the sooner he figured out who wanted her dead, the better. I need to take Kirby out for a bit. Will you please stay here with Roscoe? Sure. I don't mind playing with the puppy. Better than watching television. She wrinkled her nose. Not sure why anyone bothers to get cable. It's awful. He chuckled. I agree with you there. I won't be long. He headed for the door, then turned and crossed to the table. He quickly wrote his cell number on a napkin. If you need something, call me. I'm sure I'll be fine. He nodded in agreement. If he thought she was in danger, he wouldn't go. But no one knew where they were at this new motel. He'd purposefully held that detail back from Grossman. Okay, see you soon. Kirby was full of energy, giving him a twinge of guilt over keeping him cooped up for so long. The shepherd ran full out when he took him off leash, enjoying his freedom. When the large dog finished running in circles, Bryce put him through his training routine, which was basically viewed as playtime for the K9. Kirby was breathing heavily when they finished, his tongue lolling out to the side. Good boy, he praised, clipping the leash to his collar. He turned to walk back to the motel when he heard the rumble of a motorcycle engine. More than one, based on the decibel level. Bryce crouched behind the children's playground, raking his gaze over the roads lining each side of the park. Thankfully, it was dark enough that he didn't think the cyclists would recognize him. 2 motorcycles came down the road first, followed by 2 more. His heart pounded in his chest as he peered through the darkness. He couldn't tell if they were members of the Desert Death Rays or not, but the possibility was strong that they were. If so, the 4 motorcycle riders could be cruising the area, searching for Callie. Chapter 8. Hearing the rumble of motorcycles brought an instinctive fight or flight response. Callie swept Roscoe into her arms and darted through the connecting door. She reached for the door handle, intending to leave, then abruptly stopped. Wait a minute. What was she thinking? She couldn't go outside. Not if the men driving by on motorcycles were members of the Death Rays. She hesitated, cuddling Roscoe closer still. Maybe she was overreacting. There were other motorcycle gangs in the city the size of Los Angeles. They weren't all out to kill her. She turned and retraced her steps to her motel room. Then she crept over to the window, peering between the blinds. Her heart thudded painfully against her sternum as the sound of the motorcycles grew louder. Were more of them coming? Did they know she was there? Please, Lord, keep us safe. The prayer flashed in her mind, and she could easily imagine Bryce saying the words. Maybe that's where the prayer had come from because her fear eased just a little. She took several deep breaths as she waited. Time slowed to a crawl. Callie wasn't sure how long she stood at the window, but eventually, the loud engine noise faded away until only the usual vehicle traffic sounds could be heard. Still, she waited, her gaze fixated on the Christmas lights shining brightly on a business across the street. Christmas, the day people around the world celebrated the birth of Jesus. For years, December 25th was just a holiday where most businesses were closed. She'd worked plenty of other holidays, including Thanksgiving, Easter, and every other holiday. The banks seemed to be closed, while the restaurants remained open for business. Generally, her only guaranteed day off was Christmas. Yet she hadn't looked forward to what was essentially a lonely day off. Certainly nothing special. She doubted Bryce treated the holiday that way. No, she knew he'd attend church services the way she had gone with her parents when she was young. Before her father passed away. And before her mother had married Wade out of desperation. She remembered the brief glimpse she'd caught of her mother earlier that day. For 12 years she hadn't dwelled much on her mother's choices. What was the point? Going over it all had been too painful. Now, she couldn't seem to stop thinking about them. The way her mother had told her not to rock the boat, to do whatever Wade wanted so they wouldn't be kicked out. The way her mother had put up with his constant berating. Enough. She gave herself a mental shake. She'd never have a relationship with her mother. Not until the day Wade was no longer in the picture. And even then, the robotic woman she'd seen earlier had borne no resemblance to the mother she remembered as a child. No, any sort of relationship between them was highly unlikely. A shadow emerged from the darkness, and she breathed a sigh of relief when she recognized Bryce and Kirby. Shaking off her troublesome thoughts, she quickly stepped away from the window. Bryce unlocked the door and stepped inside with Kirby at his side. His intense gaze raked over her. "Did you hear the motorcycles? Are you okay?" "Yes, I heard them, and I'm fine." She forced a smile. "I admit I panicked at first but relaxed when they left." "There were 4 motorcycles, Callie." He closed and locked the door. "I would have gotten here quicker, but I didn't want to draw their attention. Regardless, I don't believe their driving by was a coincidence." She sank down onto the edge of the bed. "You really think they were looking for me?" He grimaced. "I can't say for sure, but it sure seemed that way. Maybe I'm overreacting, but it's better to be overly cautious than to underestimate these guys." She shivered, realizing he was right to be concerned. Yet she was also tired of running. So tired of moving from one place to the next. But she didn't let on, facing him directly. "Okay, then what should we do? Leave and find another place to stay before they can find us here." She hated the thought of Bryce wasting more of his money, or the money Caleb had provided when he'd given them the SUV. "No, we don't have to leave just yet. I don't think they'll find us here." Bryce sat beside her, placing his arm around her shoulders. She gratefully leaned against him, absorbing his strength. "But we will move again first thing in the morning." "Why first thing?" "If they were safe, it would be nice to stay put for a while." He hesitated, then said, "It could be they're looking at possible motels where we may be hiding out. There are plenty of others around. I'm thinking they'll make a list and maybe come back tomorrow to find us." Just thinking about the explosion at the Green Tree Motel made her wince. She could see his point. Okay. She trusted his instincts more than her own these days. Ironic that the man she once ran away from was holding her now. They sat together for several minutes. As much as she would have preferred to stay with Bryce for as long as he'd have her, she forced herself to move away. He was a nice man. One who didn't deserve someone like her. She avoided his direct gaze as she tucked her hair behind her ear. "Ah, do you think it's safe enough to take Roscoe out?" "Yes, but I'll go with you. We'll take him around the corner of the building, out of view from the street." "I'm sure we'd hear the motorcycles before they got close," she said wryly. "Probably, but humor me anyway." He gave her a quick one-armed hug, then rose. "Come on, I'll show you. It's the same area Kirby used earlier." She set Roscoe on the floor. The puppy happily followed Bryce and Kirby outside. It was a good thing the pup had a role model in Kirby. And a playmate, even if Kirby only put up with him for so long. Bryce led the way around the corner of the building. There was a small open area there mostly covered with weeds that was perfect for taking care of doggy business. She'd brought the baggies Bryce had purchased earlier from the pet store with her to clean up the mess. The way Bryce did with Kirby. She glanced at him as the dogs got busy doing their thing. "Bryce, will you keep Roscoe once the danger is over?" "Me?" His eyes widened in surprise. "I thought you would keep him." She looked down at the puppy, keenly aware of how much she would miss him. "I wish I could, but keeping him is impossible. For one thing, I'm homeless. And even more importantly, I've been working 2 jobs just to keep my head above water. I'm not sure I can afford to feed him, and frankly, he's too young to be left home alone that long." Bryce frowned. "I can help you." "Don't." She lifted her hand to stop him. "I appreciate the kind gesture, but I need to pay my own way. My situation isn't your problem, it's mine. Just keep Roscoe for me. Please?" She blinked back tears. "I can't bear the thought of him ending up at a shelter." "I'll keep him." Bryce spoke without hesitation. "I promise I won't let Roscoe end up in a shelter." Good. A large weight rolled off her shoulders, knowing the puppy would have a good home with Bryce and Kirby. Even though she'd miss him terribly, she'd rest easier knowing Roscoe was happy. Thank you. You don't have to thank me, Bryce said in a low voice. I care about you and Roscoe. And I really wish you'd let me help. There's no reason for you to continue living on the street. You're already helping by keeping me safe. She met his gaze in the darkness. I want you to know how much I appreciate you being here, Bryce. But I won't accept anything more. You've done so much for me already. He looked as if he wanted to say more, but he remained silent. She wished she knew what he was thinking, then she decided it didn't matter. Once the police found the evidence they needed to put Charlie Sancho behind bars, she and Bryce could go back to their respective lives. When the dogs were finished, Bryce led the way back inside. Thankfully, there was no sign of any motorcyclists. She was confident Bryce was right and they were safe here. At least for now. She told herself not to think about what the morning might bring. Bryce and Kirby went into their own room, leaving the connecting door open. She brushed her teeth, then crawled into bed. Maybe it was a bad habit to start doing such a thing, but she brought the puppy up onto the bed with her. She cuddled with Roscoe in the darkness. It was wonderful to have the dog with her. She hadn't realized what a difference it made to have a pet. She kissed the top of his head, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, she relaxed, drifting off to sleep. At some point, she awoke to Roscoe licking her cheek. Groggily, she glanced over at the clock. 3 a.m. The little guy was wiggling around, as if he needed to go out. It was better than his having an accident in bed, but she inwardly groaned. Seriously? She held the puppy in her arms as she slid from the bed. She was wearing shorts and a t-shirt, her usual sleepwear. The way the puppy was acting, she didn't have much time to waste, so she didn't bother to change her clothes. When she opened the door though, the cold air made her gasp. You better hurry, Roscoe. She set the puppy down, then crossed her arms over her chest. Before I turn into an ice sculpture. What's going on? She spun around to face Bryce and Kirby. She should have realized the K9 would wake up when she opened the door. Roscoe needs to go. Get inside, I'll take care of it. Bryce gave her a gentle push toward the door. He was dressed in his jeans and flannel shirt, making her wonder if he'd stayed up all night or had simply slept in his clothes. She stepped back inside the room, but kept the door open. Barely 2 minutes later, Bryce brought the dogs back inside. That was fast. She sighed. I hope Roscoe getting up at 3 a.m. isn't a new trend. Me too, Bryce said wryly. I'm going to take Kirby out to look around. Why? She reached for her sweater, feeling self-conscious about her shorts and t-shirt. Is there a problem? No, but now that we're up, we may as well make sure things remain quiet out there. He smiled reassuringly. Get some sleep. She arched a brow. Doubt that will happen. He shrugged and turned toward the door. This won't take long. Okay, thanks. The moment he and Kirby left the room, she quickly dressed. Then, because she tried to be prepared for the worst, she packed her small suitcase. It wasn't easy to cram most of Roscoe's new things inside, but she sat on the suitcase to squeeze it shut long enough to zip it closed. Hopefully, the worn suitcase would hold. It was heavier now, but she managed to drag it to the side of the door. Then she placed Roscoe's water and food dishes into a bag she found lining the motel garbage can. She was ready to leave if necessary. And she was wide awake, despite the early morning hour. The puppy had curled next to her pillow, his eyes drifting shut. It would have been nice to get a few more hours of sleep, but attempting that would be a fruitless effort. She had one of those brains that turned on and stayed on once she was up and moving around. The room had a small coffee maker, so she made a cup for herself, then got another one ready for Bryce in case he wanted one when he returned. She sipped the hot brew gratefully, wondering where they'd go next. With the death rays investigation having been turned over to Bryce's boss, there was no reason they couldn't head back to San Bernardino. Granted, Simon had managed to find her and Ava there, but he was in jail. Since Simon had sent his closest men to track them down, she highly doubted Charlie Sancho knew anything about it. And she was confident Pedro would welcome her back to the Lizard Lounge. She heard someone outside the motel room door. Knowing Bryce and Kirby had returned, she jumped up and went to open it. But the person outside was not Bryce. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized Wade Stiller's leering grin. "Hello, Clarice. Are you happy to see me?" "No." She tried to slam the door shut, but he stuck his foot out to prevent it from closing, then leveled his gun at her chest. She froze, bracing herself for the inevitable gunshot that would kill her where she stood. "Now, is that any way to treat your loving stepfather?" His evil grin widened. "I've been searching for you for so long, Clarice. I knew this day would come. I knew I'd find you, and finish what you started all those years ago." "Get away from me," she hissed. His creepy grin vanished as he gestured with the barrel of his gun. "Scream and I'll shoot. Go inside." Why did he want her to go into the room? Was he planning to pick up his sexual assault where he'd left off 12 years ago? She stumbled backward, doing her best not to collapse in a heap of despair, sick with the realization that the gunman who'd taken 2 shots at her had been Wade and not Charlie Sancho. Her mind whirled as she tried to come up with a way to escape. Bryce was outside with Kirby. Maybe he could do something. Yet she feared any attempt to take Wade down would result in them being shot to death. And the dogs too. No, she couldn't bear it. Not Bryce and Kirby. They couldn't die because of her. "Please, Lord. I know I don't deserve your help, but I'm begging you to keep us all safe in your care." Bryce rounded the corner of the motel in time to see a man standing in front of Callie's motel room door with a gun. He recognized Wade Stiller from the photograph he'd found of the detective online. He'd been wrong. All this time, the gunman searching for Callie was Wade, not Charlie Sancho. In that moment, he knew Stiller must have learned about Callie's whereabouts from Grossman. Not that the guy would have done it on purpose. Yet the end result was the same. He never should have called his boss. Somehow, his phone number had been traced to this location. But it was too late for regrets. He needed to come up with a way to take Wade down without hurting Callie. When the large man stepped across the threshold to enter the room, he darted around the corner and quickly stopped the door from closing all the way. He crouched down, found a small stone, and used it to keep the door ajar, praying Wade wouldn't notice. Kirby stayed silent at his side as if sensing the danger. He gave the K9 a hand signal for quiet, then considered his options. Going in behind Stiller might catch the detective off guard, but it could also put Callie at risk if the guy fired his weapon. Yet there was no easy way for Bryce to get into his adjoining room without making noise. The click of a keycard would be loud at this hour of the night. Unless he could create a diversion. He glanced around the deserted parking lot. Nothing to use there, but as he looked down at Kirby, he knew what he had to do. His chest tightened painfully as he swallowed hard and gave the dog the hand signal to stay. The large German shepherd stood still outside the door, waiting for the next command. Bryce silently moved to the next door, his keycard ready. He also held his Sig Sauer, knowing he'd only have seconds to react. If that. He and Kirby would have to move simultaneously. He gave the dog the command to attack, then swiped the keycard. The dog let out several loud, resounding barks as he pushed the door open and bounded inside. Bryce bolted into his room, heading straight for the opening between their rooms. He shouted, "Stop, police!" Time seemed to move in slow motion. Kirby knocked Wade off balance, even as the detective turned to see Bryce. Wade swung his gun toward him, leaving him little choice but to respond in kind. He fired 2 quick shots at the detective, as the older cop fired at him. Bryce ducked. Thankfully, Wade's aim was wildly inaccurate as he fell backward beneath the force of Bryce's bullets. The man hit the floor and didn't move. "Kirby. Callie." He ran forward, praying they hadn't been hit. Chapter 9. The moment she'd heard Kirby barking, she'd made her move. While Wade turned in surprise to see Kirby coming through the door, she'd lipped onto the bed, grabbed Roscoe, who'd joined in the barking frenzy, then rolled across the mattress to hit the floor on the other side of the bed, using the mattress and frame as a shield. The barrage of gunfire had hurt her ears. She'd bent over Roscoe, protecting him the best she could. The puppy squirmed in her arms, clearly not liking the sharp reports any more than she did. "Callie? Are you okay?" She lifted her head in time to see Bryce rushing forward. He stared at her for a moment, then turned and dropped to his knees beside Kirby. "You okay, boy? Are you?" Pushing her hair out of her face, she rose on shaky legs and came around the bed. She abruptly stopped when she saw Wade's body. Blood oozed from a bullet wound in his chest and head. Her stepfather was dead. "Good boy, Kirby," Bryce murmured, bending and kissing the top of the shepherd's head. "Good boy. He's not hurt." Callie carefully stepped over Wade's body. "No, thankfully." Bryce gave the dog another pat, then rose to take her into his arms, ignoring the puppy that squirmed between them. "I was so worried you'd been injured. I knew you'd come to the rescue." Her words were muffled against his chest. She listened to the rapid beat of his heart for a moment, then lifted her head to look up at him. When Kirby caught Wade's attention, I dove for cover, bringing Roscoe with me. "Smart woman." He lifted his hand to cup her cheek. "I'm sorry I had to shoot him, but it was him or me." "Don't apologize, you saved my life." She couldn't deny the wave of relief she felt in knowing Wade was dead. He stared down at her for a long minute, then lowered his head to kiss her. She reveled in his kiss, although Roscoe's moving around was distracting. She broke off their embrace with a wry smile. "I think Roscoe wants down." "Not in here, we need to preserve the evidence." Bryce was back in cop mode. "Come this way with me, we'll stay in my room. I need to call my boss." They moved through the connecting door. Kirby stretched out in front of the threshold between the rooms as if on guard, in case Wade or another threat approached. She liked the way Bryce kept one arm around her as he made the call. "Sergeant Grossman? There's been a shooting incident involving Detective Wade Stiller." There was a pause, then Bryce added, "No sir, I'm afraid he's dead. He held Callie at gunpoint, then turned to shoot at me. I fired in self-defense." Another pause, then, "Yes sir. We'll be here." It occurred to her that Bryce was in serious trouble over this. "Bryce, we can leave before the police get here." "No, Callie. We're not leaving." He smiled gently. "Don't you see? The danger is finally over. You don't have to run anymore. I'm not worried about me, I'm concerned about you." She didn't hide her frustration. "What if your boss doesn't believe you? What if you lose your job? Or worse, get tossed in jail?" "Whoa, hold on. Your concern over my welfare is touching, but I won't be arrested over this. I will be placed on administrative leave while they investigate, but I'm not worried about the outcome." I don't trust." She stopped and drew in a ragged breath. Maybe she didn't trust the authorities, but Bryce did. "Okay, I'll try not to panic, but I can't stand the thought of you getting in trouble over helping me." "I won't get in trouble over saving your life," he corrected with a crooked grin. Then his expression turned grim. "Killing a man is never good, and I can't lie, it's worse if he's a cop. But I did what was necessary, and if I was in the same situation, I'd do it again." See? This is what she was concerned about. There was still time. No, there wasn't. Shrieking sirens split the air, making Roscoe bark again in protest. Through the window curtains, red and blue lights flashed. She forced herself to step back from Bryce's embrace. He surprised her by giving her another quick kiss before turning to open the door for the new arrivals. 4 uniformed officers approached with their guns held at the ready. Bryce lifted his arms in surrender. "Officer Bryce Flynn, off duty, with my K9 Kirby." He nodded toward his weapon on his belt. "You'll want to take my Sig Sauer for evidence." "Don't move," one of the cops ordered as another stepped forward to take the gun. "Okay, Officer Flynn, you want to explain what happened here?" "He saved my life," Callie said loudly, drawing the officer's attention. "My stepfather has been trying to kill me. He was holding me at gunpoint when Bryce and Kirby caused a diversion. I was able to get to safety, but then I heard gunfire. She paused and added, I heard 4 shots almost simultaneously. Who are you? The officer who'd taken Bryce's gun asked. Callie, or Clarice Abernathy. She flushed when Bryce raised a brow. I've been going by the name Callie Burgess. Burgess is my grandmother's maiden name. 2 officers moved through the room and across to where Wade lay. This is Detective Stiller. I know who he is, Bryce said calmly. The problem is that he tried to kill Callie twice. Well, 3 times if you include the bombing of the Green Tree Motel. One of the officers let out a low whistle. We'd better call the sergeant. I already notified Sergeant Grossman, Bryce said. He'll be here shortly. The next hour passed in a blur. Callie had to give her statement several times, and she desperately wished she'd seen Wade point his gun at Bryce. Unfortunately, she'd been diving to the bed, grabbing Roscoe, and rolling onto the floor. All she could say with certainty was that she heard the 4 gunshots going off almost at the exact same time. She was finished with the officers long before Bryce was. Since she didn't have anywhere to go, she sat on the bed in his room, playing with Roscoe as the cops grilled Bryce over his decision to discharge his weapon. Dawn lightened the sky outside. Her stomach rumbled with hunger, and she knew they needed to feed the dogs too. Callie? She glanced up to see Bryce crossing toward her. Are you ready to get out of here? More than ready. I'm glad they're not forcing you to stay any longer. Me too. I'm hungry. Ditto, but we need to feed the dogs first. Her gaze softened when she eyed Kirby. She'd heard how Bryce had instructed Kirby to attack Wade as he came in through the door to the connecting room. Humbling to realize that without Kirby and Bryce working so well as a team, she'd have died today. We'll do that when we get to my place. Wait, what? His place? Her heart fluttered in her chest. Ah, really? Are you sure? We can't stay here, and there's no reason to run anymore. I didn't want to suggest going to my house earlier. I was afraid you'd get the wrong idea. But I hope you trust me to know I'd never hurt you. He held out his hand. But there is a stop we need to make along the way. She stood. What kind of stop? He hesitated, then shrugged. You'll see. Because the motel was a crime scene, she wasn't allowed to take any of her things, not even her blood-spattered suitcase, which was lying on its side near the door. She followed Bryce to the borrowed SUV, still grappling with the realization the danger was over. Wade was dead and would never hurt her or her mother again. Bryce navigated the early morning traffic, which was already congested. When he made a familiar turn, one they'd taken yesterday, she straightened in her seat. You live this way? Not exactly, but that's not where we're going. He glanced at her. I thought you'd want to see your mother. No. Yes. Maybe. Her mother wasn't the same woman she remembered from when she was young. Then she understood that Bryce felt it was their duty to let her mother know Wade was dead. Her stomach churned as she battled a cascade of emotion. Hope, fear, anticipation, dread, and yes, maybe even love. Bryce pulled into the driveway and shut down the engine. She couldn't make herself open the door. I don't know if this is a good idea, she protested. She deserves to know that you're alive and Wade is dead. Maybe he was right. She nodded and set Roscoe on the floor. They both got out of the SUV and approached the White House. Bryce rang the bell, and they stood for what seemed like an eternity before the door opened, revealing her mother. No soliciting, her mother said dully. I'm LAPD Officer Bryce Flynn. I'm afraid I have some news about your husband, Wade Stiller. Bryce glanced at her, but she couldn't speak. May we please come in? No. Just tell me which hospital he's at. There wasn't a flicker of emotion in her mother's eyes, making Callie wonder if the woman she once knew was dead too. Wade Stiller is dead, Bryce said. And this is your daughter, Callie. For a split second there was no response, then her mother crumpled into a heap, breaking into deep, racking sobs. Callie turned and walked back to the SUV. She didn't need to witness her mother's grief over losing her husband. The woman she'd once loved no longer existed. Torn between going to comfort Callie and dealing with Helen Stiller, Bryce wished he'd let the cops take care of the notification. But he'd convinced his boss to let him and Callie do it. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, awkwardly trying to comfort the grieving woman. "Someone from the department will be reaching out to talk to you." "My loss." Callie's mother swiped at her eyes and managed to pull herself together. "I'm happy he's gone. I know that's a terrible thing to say, but it's true." She leaned weakly against the doorframe, then frowned. "Is that really Clarice?" Bryce grimaced, realizing he'd flubbed on the name. "Yes, that's your daughter." "She's alive?" Helen looked truly perplexed. "I don't understand. Wade told me Clarice died of a drug overdose years ago." Of course, Wade had told her a big fat lie. His jaw tightened with anger, but he held himself in check. "Miss Stiller, Clarice goes by Callie now, and she's very much alive." "My baby girl is alive," she whispered, then pushed away from the door, staggering past him toward the SUV. "Clarice? I'm sorry I didn't recognize you." "Clarice, wait. Don't go. Please." Callie turned from the SUV, holding Roscoe in her arms, using the puppy as a shield between herself and her mother. "I'm sorry about Wade." "I'm not. I know it's wrong, but I used to pray for a way to escape him." Bryce watched as the mother and daughter stared at each other. "He told me you were dead, and seeing you now, I know how stupid I was to believe him." A flicker of uncertainty darkened Callie's eyes. "He did?" "Yes. I wanted to have a funeral service for you, but Wade." Her voice trailed off. Bryce was irritated at how Helen had taken the easy way out, repeatedly caving to Wade's demands. She'd prayed for a way out, but hadn't found the courage to take action herself. Callie had been strong enough to leave when Helen had been weak. Yet he also hadn't walked a mile in Helen's shoes either. Battered women often stayed with their abusers, something he had difficulty understanding. He forced himself to hold back from showing his derision. "Yes, well, you're free of Wade now," Callie said. We need to go." "Go?" Helen clasped her hands together, looking a bit lost. "Oh, I thought you might stay for a while." "No, I can't." Callie's expression softened just a bit. "But soon. I need a little time. And you have a lot of things going on too." Helen nodded. "Okay. I understand. But Clarice, you're welcome to come back any time. I would like to talk to you. Please." Callie slowly nodded. "We will talk more at some point. I'll let you know, okay?" "Okay," Helen agreed. Bryce was proud of the way Callie had handled her mother. Although her initial running away to the SUV had been her usual way of dealing with stress, she'd turned it around and had her first conversation with her mother in over 12 years. Hopefully, the first of many more. Helen turned and walked back inside the house. He joined Callie near the SUV. "Are you okay?" "Yeah." She blew out a breath. It never occurred to me he'd tell her I was dead. He couldn't say what he thought about that, so he remained silent. "I know what you're thinking," she said. She was stupid and weak for listening to him, for staying with him, and for putting up with his abuse. But she's still my mother, so I guess I'll need to find a way to forgive her. His annoyance faded. "We'll both find a way. God teaches us to forgive those who trespass against us." "Yes?" She glanced back at the house. "She's not the woman I remember." "Hey, you're not the same person you were back then either," he said softly. "You're beautiful, strong, smart, and courageous. I know your mother took the easy way out, but she suffered for her decision too. I'm not all those things, but I am different, that much is true." She slid into the passenger seat with Roscoe on her lap. "And yes, she has suffered. We both have. I guess that may be the starting point, huh?" "Yes. You can move forward from here, Callie. If you want to." She nodded slowly. "I'll come back someday. I just need a little time. And I'm starving and would love some coffee. Can we please get something to eat?" "Sure." He jogged around to the driver's side. "We'll grab something on the way to my place. Don't worry, There are 3 bedrooms, you'll have all the privacy you need. Okay, but where exactly do you live? I'm blessed to have a house, he admitted. It's small, but the payments aren't too bad. My parents sold it to me after they decided to move to Arizona. Their goal was to make enough to pay for their new place, which was much cheaper than what property goes for here in LA. I'm sure, she agreed. He glanced over to see her staring out the passenger side window. He felt bad over what she'd been through over the past few days, especially this recent meeting with her mother. He wanted to ask her to stay with him over Christmas, but he wasn't sure how to approach the subject without giving her the wrong idea. Or the right idea. The one in which he didn't want her to go back to living on the street, or putting in long hours at 2 different waitressing jobs. His home wasn't that far from her mother's, thankfully. They grabbed breakfast meals at the fast food restaurant closest to his house. Bryce couldn't deny feeling a bit nervous as he led the way inside. He decorated for Christmas, out of habit more than anything. He'd almost decided against it, but when he saw Callie's eyes light up at his tall Christmas tree, he was glad he'd gone through the trouble. This is a really nice place, she said in awe. I love your tree. So much nicer than the one I found in the dumpster. Thanks. Would you mind making the coffee while I feed the dogs? She nodded and followed him into the kitchen. Roscoe was awake and ready to play, and Kirby put up with his antics as Bryce pulled out 4 bowls, 2 for each dog. Roscoe attacked his food and water with enthusiasm, dancing around his bowl with excitement. It made him chuckle, and he noticed Kirby ate faster than usual too, probably knowing the puppy would try to share his meal if he didn't. While the coffee brewed, he set the breakfast sandwiches on the table. Callie quickly joined him. I think it's my turn to say grace. She smiled hesitantly. Don't expect me to sound as eloquent as you, though. God doesn't mind how we sound as long as we believe. Yes? Well. She took his hand and bowed her head. Dear Lord, we thank you for keeping us safe in your care. We are grateful to be here to share this food, and we ask that you continue to watch over us, including my mom. Amen. Amen. He longed to pull her into his arms but restrained himself. That was beautiful. You're a good teacher. She unwrapped her sandwich. When we're finished eating, will you drive me to San Bernardino? He stared at her, his sandwich halfway to his mouth. Why? I thought you'd stay here for a few days. That's a kind gesture, but I need to get my life back on track. She shrugged. You've been wonderful, Bryce. I can't thank you enough for everything you've done, but I can't just live off your generosity. She could, but she wouldn't. He took a bite of his sandwich, tasting nothing. Callie may not realize what she was doing, but he did. She was running away, again. Chapter 10. The stark disappointment on Bryce's face brought a strange wave of guilt. Not that she had anything to feel guilty about. He'd appreciate having her out of his hair. Wouldn't he? They ate in silence, the Christmassy feeling in the house fading fast. Easy enough to compare Bryce's spacious 3-bedroom home with a gorgeous Christmas tree to her minuscule apartment with the small, bare and crooked tree she'd rescued from a dumpster. Yeah, she and Bryce were about as different as those Christmas trees. When the coffee finished brewing, Bryce stood and went to grab some. He brought a cup for her too, then returned to his seat. The uncomfortable silence stretched on, making her wish she'd never come back here with him. In her defense, her main thought had been to make sure Roscoe was cared for. Bryce eyed her over the rim of his mug. Aren't you tired of running? Yes. The word reverberated through her mind, but she didn't admit it. I'm not running. I'm picking up the pieces of my life. You're running and you know it. Bryce leaned forward, bracing his elbows on the table. I get that you've been on your own for years, Callie. Too many years. But you lived with Ava for a while, didn't you? Yes, but that's different. We were both in the same boat of trying to make ends meet. So if I lost my job over shooting Wade and needed to find a new one, you wouldn't stick around to help. Of course I would. She stared at him. Do you think that will happen? I'll talk to your boss again, make him understand what Wade was like. I'll even explain why I ran away from him all those years ago. Another thought hit her. And I'm sure we can get my mother to explain about the abuse she suffered too. A half-smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I accept your offer of help, Callie. And would very much appreciate your mother's testimony too. So why can't you accept my help in return? She frowned, realizing what he'd done. That was sneaky. But honest. Because while you'd help others in a heartbeat, you sit there and refuse to accept the same in kind. She dropped her gaze to her coffee mug. He was right. She'd have pulled out all the stops to help Bryce. But no matter what he thought, their situations were different. It's my fault you're in trouble. My fault that Wade came after me. It's Wade's fault, not yours. His sharp tone almost made her flinch. And if we're following that logic, it's also Wade's fault that you're in a financial predicament. I can't bear the idea of you living on the street. So again, Callie, why won't you let me help you? Because I love you. For a split second, she thought she'd said the words out loud. But no, Bryce was still watching, waiting for an answer. Heaven help her, she couldn't come up with a rational reason. Okay, you're right. I could use some help. But I can't just move in with you. He slowly nodded. Maybe I can pay the rent on your apartment. Cover the expenses through the New Year's holiday. Waffling, she bit her lip. Was it better to let him pay her rent, or to stay in his guest room for a few weeks? The answer was glaringly obvious. Staying here would be the best thing for Bryce. If his job was on the line, the last thing he should do was spend his hard-earned money on her. She sipped her coffee, then set her mug on the table. Okay, obviously I need a place to stay for a while. If you're sure you don't mind having company, I'd like to stay here. It's better than you spending your money on a motel for me. Thank you. He smiled. That wasn't too hard, was it? You have no idea, she muttered. I think I do. He stood and held out his hand. She took it, allowing him to pull her up. Callie Burgess, do you trust me? Yes, she answered without hesitation. Good. Now, I need to tell you one more thing. His expression turned serious. I don't want to pressure you, and no matter how you feel in return, the offer to stay here with no strings attached is still open. Okay? She was having trouble following his logic. I love you. I know we haven't known each other long and that you need time to adjust to everything that has happened, but that doesn't change how I feel about you. It doesn't change how much I love you. She almost pinched herself to see if she was dreaming. Maybe Wade wasn't dead and her mother wasn't happy to see her, and none of this was real. Roscoe jumped up, raking his very real and sharp claws on her jeans. Nope. Not dreaming. Hey, don't worry, I'm not going to pressure you. The awkward way Bryce backpedaled made her smile. You're not. I'm just surprised. She felt her cheeks flush. You were married before, and obviously could have anyone you wanted. Someone without the baggage I'm lugging around. Stop it, I'm sick of the way you keep putting yourself down. His tone held the edge of annoyance. Do you know how many teenagers who run away end up as prostitutes or drug addicts or who knows what? You are a special person, Callie. And while I can appreciate you may not care about me the same way, please don't ever insinuate you're not good enough for me, or any other guy lucky enough to be with you. She'd never had someone yell at her while being so complimentary at the same time. For some strange reason, it made her want to laugh or cry. Or both. I do feel the same way, Bryce. She took a step closer to him, wishing he'd take her into his arms. She lifted her chin and met his gaze head-on. I'm not sure how it happened, but I love you too. Are you sure? He searched her gaze. There's no rush, in fact, I don't know why I had to blurt this all now, I should have just kept my big mouth shut. I'm sure, she interrupted. Then she reached up to wrap her arms around his neck. I've never said those words to anyone, Bryce. I love you. Then she smiled cheekily. Even though you're a cop. Ah, Callie. We'll find a way to work through our differences, you'll see. He captured her mouth in a deep kiss. She pulled him closer, melting into his loving embrace. Words couldn't describe how cherished she felt in Bryce's arms. But when Roscoe continued to try to climb up her jeans, she reluctantly broke off the kiss. I'm sorry, but the puppy is driving me crazy. Maybe I need to take him out. Kirby and I will go with you. He slipped his arm around her waist. You do realize what today is, don't you? She frowned, thinking back over the hours that seemed to mesh together. The day before Christmas Eve. That's right. And since I'm off work today, and over the holiday, we can celebrate Christmas together. Here. With the dogs, he added with a wry chuckle as Roscoe did his thing, then chased and barked at Kirby. She couldn't imagine anything better than spending Christmas with Bryce. But then she thought about her mother, and realized she'd probably have to see her again soon too. It wouldn't be easy, but maybe over time they could find some common ground. Some way back to a mother-daughter relationship. For the first time since her father died, Callie found herself looking forward to Christmas. To spending time with Bryce, and even visiting with her mother. With love, anything was possible. Bryce scowled when an LAPD squad pulled into his driveway. He instinctively moved in front of Callie, as if to protect her from further questioning. Sarge, what brings you here? Flynn. Ms. Burgess. Sergeant Grossman nodded at Callie. Sorry to bother you, but I have an update. Maybe we can talk inside. Since he didn't get the feeling Grossman was there to arrest him, he nodded. Sure, come in. We have fresh coffee if you're interested. That would be great. Bryce held the door open for his boss, Callie, and the dogs. Callie headed over to the counter to pour Grossman a mug of coffee. The three of them sat around his small table. Grossman took a sip of the brew, then sighed. Thanks, that hits the spot. Bryce tried not to show his impatience. You have news? Yeah. Grossman took one more sip of his coffee, then set the mug aside. Detectives Tracy Hammer and Lyle Gallo were able to get a search warrant for the slammer and the apartments up above, where one Charlie Sancho happened to be living. His boss smiled. They found a gun that matched the make and model of the bullet taken out of Otto Redmond's heart. Sancho has been arrested for Otto's murder. He lived above the bar. He wanted to smack himself for being obtuse. That possibility never occurred to me. You weren't supposed to be investigating the Redmond homicide at all, Grossman said sharply. He winced. Yeah, I know. And he wouldn't have done it if not for Callie's past and brief relationship with Otto. How did they get a search warrant? They lifted a fingerprint off your SUV. It belonged to a guy named Archie Weller, and he was a known associate of Sancho. When they did some recon around the slammer, they realized the death rays were trying to make a comeback. They convinced a judge to get a search warrant based on the weapons they saw inside the place, and he complied. He nodded. So basically, you're telling me that if I hadn't gone there and gotten my SUV damaged, the detectives wouldn't have been able to close the case. He grinned. You're welcome. Grossman was not amused. Whatever. Just remember you're still on administrative leave for shooting Wade Stiller. His smile faded. I understand. Excuse me, but have you spoken to Wade's wife? Callie asked. Grossman turned to face her. Yes, I have. And I heard about the abuse she suffered at Stiller's hands. Good. Callie lifted her chin. Because he tried to rape me back when I was 16. I ran away and never went back. Now his boss looked surprised. Ms. Stiller didn't mention that. She may not have known, although she should have suspected. Callie took a deep breath, then said more calmly, I'm telling you now. My real name is Clarice Abernathy. You'll find I was listed as a missing teenager roughly 12 years ago. Grossman abruptly turned to face Bryce. Is that why you shot him? No, sir. I would have been happy to arrest him, but he aimed his weapon with the clear intent to shoot, leaving me little choice but to take him down. I heard you the first time, Grossman said dryly. So far, the evidence seems to support your story. Callie opened her mouth to say something, but he gave a small shake of his head. It's okay, Callie. The truth will come out. You should know the motel clerk told me he heard the dog barking followed by 4 gunshots that he described as being very close together. Grossman shrugged. The investigation isn't over yet, but I think your story will hold up, Flynn. Sounds like Stiller doesn't have many friends in the department these days. Turns out, Internal Affairs had been investigating him for the past few months due to the network picking up a ton of porn on his work computer. No surprise there. I'm glad to hear it. He smiled as Kirby came over to sit beside him. Thanks to Kirby, we were able to distract him just long enough to get in position. His boss nodded. Well, I just wanted you to hear about the death rays. With Sancho and his buddy Archie both in jail, it looks as if the rest of the bikers have scattered. Grossman took another long sip of his coffee, then stood. Enjoy your Christmas off, Flynn. I'll be in touch when you're cleared to return to work. He rose and offered Grossman his hand. Thanks, Sarge. Grossman tripped over Roscoe, nearly falling on his face. Callie rushed forward to pick Roscoe up. I'm so sorry, he's just a puppy. It's okay. Grossman straightened his uniform, then left. Naughty boy, she scolded, although her lips quirked in a smile. You have to watch where you're going, Roscoe. The puppy licked her chin. Come into the living room with me. Bryce caught her hand, drawing her toward the sofa. You know you're going to have to keep him, right? Keep? Oh, you mean Roscoe? She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder as they faced the Christmas tree. I can't, not when I work long hours. You don't have to work long hours. You can work however many hours you want, but there's no rush for you to find a new place to live. He wanted nothing more than for her to stay here indefinitely. You can stay at Darla's Diner if you like, since they'll probably be open again after Christmas. But you don't need to keep the job at the Flame. He grinned as Roscoe jumped up into her lap. Look at him. Roscoe needs you, Callie. He hesitated, then kissed her temple. I need you. Oh, Bryce. She kissed his cheek, then snuggled closer. Roscoe made a circle in her lap, then closed his eyes and fell asleep. I've always wanted a puppy for Christmas. Now I have that and more. I have you too. His heart melted as a wave of peace, joy, and happiness filled his heart. I love you, Callie. I love you too. They sat together for a long time, enjoying each other's company, while gazing at the Christmas tree. This was Bryce's second chance at love. And he silently promised to work doubly hard to do it right this time. Putting Callie above himself every day for the rest of their lives. Epilogue. Valentine's Day. Callie put a hand over her stomach, praying she wouldn't be sick. Did all brides feel this way? Yeah, probably not. Come on, Callie, why are you so nervous? Her best friend, Ava Ramirez, came up to stand beside her, wearing a red matron of honor dress. Ava smiled and hugged her. You look beautiful. I'm getting married. She ran her hand over the fitted bodice of her white dress. She still had trouble comprehending how much her life had changed over the past 2 months. Now Ava's expression faltered. You still love Bryce, yes? Yes? Very much. That wasn't the problem. Walking down the aisle in a church with dozens of people staring at her. That was the problem. She drew in a deep breath and turned from the mirror. Her mother had left a few minutes ago to take her seat in the front pew. She and her mother had grown closer over the past 2 months, yet deep down, Callie knew things would never be the way they once were. Bryce had reminded her that they'd both changed over the 12 years they'd been apart. It had been difficult to reconcile with this new woman her mother was now. Yet she also noticed her mother was growing more confident lately, maybe taking a few steps closer to the woman she was before she fell into the trap of marrying Wade Stiller. It reminded her of how blessed she was to have found a man like Bryce. She turned to face Ava. Okay, I'm ready. Good. Ava beamed and handed her a bouquet of red roses. Then she picked up her bundle of white roses and turned toward the door. Follow me. When I reach the altar, that's your cue to start down the aisle. Okay. She swallowed and willed the knot in her stomach to go away. Thankfully, her dress was simple enough in a T-length, which meant she didn't have to worry about tripping over the hem. Breathe, she told herself. You can do this. Ava stood at the back of the church, giving a nod to her husband Nico, who was standing up as Bryce's best man. The church organist changed the music, signaling it was time for Ava to precede Callie down the aisle. Bryce had helped Callie legally change her name to Callie Burgess, soon to be Callie Flynn. As Ava walked down the aisle, she moved into position, sweeping her gaze over the people seated in the small church. Her side would have been completely empty if not for the Navy SEALs and their wives who'd made it a point to sit there, regardless of the rules. Several of Bryce's cop friends were on his side of the church to balance things out. When Ava reached the altar, she noticed the long look her friend exchanged with her husband, Nico. Callie couldn't help but smile at the love shining in their eyes. Her gaze wandered to where Mason and his wife, Aubrey, stood with their 2 children, Lucas and Lily. Mason was using sign language to explain to the 2 deaf children they'd adopted what was going on. Right behind them were Caleb and his wife, Charlotte, holding their brand new baby boy, Jonah, who had been born just a month ago. Beside them stood Hudson and his wife, Kendra, who was round with child, looking as if she might burst at any moment. Behind them she found Dawson and his wife, Sylvie. Sylvie was holding baby Jane, Ava and Nico's daughter. Jane had been born prematurely, but was growing like a weed, according to Ava. And lastly she saw Dallas and his wife, Maggie, who was also pregnant, and their daughter, Lainey. The church had refused to allow all the SEALs to bring their dogs, which meant they were all together back at the house, no doubt creating a ruckus with Kirby and Roscoe. From the moment she and Bryce had gotten engaged, the Navy SEALs had made it a point to welcome her into their group. As if she belonged with them. No longer an outsider. The music changed again, and it was her turn to approach. Bryce looked incredibly handsome in his black suit and tie, his gaze widening with a mixture of admiration and love when he saw her. She had to remind herself to go slowly, when in reality, she wanted to run toward him. No more running away, she thought with a smile. From this moment on, she would run toward the new life she and Bryce would have together. When she reached the front of the church, Bryce took her hand and drew her up beside him. "You're so beautiful," he whispered. "So are you," she whispered back. He smiled and tucked her hand in the curve of his arm. Together, they turned to face the pastor. Her previous nervousness was gone now. This was exactly where she wanted to be. Where she belonged. With Bryce today, tomorrow, and always. I hope you enjoyed Bryce and Callie's story, and the final wrap-up of my Call to Protect series. Are you ready to dive into my next series? Explosive Truth is the first book in my Finnegan First Responders series. Would you like to read Ryland and Devon's story? Click here.